Imagine you're warped back into the year 1847 as a 14-year-old kid who's living in the dawn of the pre-Civil War era, shaped by the Mexican-American War in the South. You're alone, illiterate, half wild, your mother's dead, and your father drinks and quotes poetry that he no longer understands. You sleep in ditches, fight for scraps, and drift westward, drawn by some invisible force, the way buzzards are drawn to the scent of rot. Now, the land is scorched and lawless, towns are no more than clusters of hovels, and men are hung from trees like wind chimes. And violence? Violence is not just common, it's currency, it's survival. This is not the West of the childhood stories. This is the real West, the one buried beneath myths, the one soaked in blood. And in that entire hell ride, you meet him, the man the size of a bear, pale as bone, bald as an egg, smiling like the devil himself, the judge. He speaks like a prophet and kills without blinking. He does not age, he does not bleed, and he does not forget. He tells you that war is God, and whether you believe him or not, he's about to show you and prove it. Now, the story that I want to talk to you about today is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. It's written in 1985. It's a novel rooted in historical truth, set during the chaotic aftermath of the Mexican-American War, pre-Civil War era. While the characters and the dialogue in this book might be fictional, the violence, the setting, and the events that inspired it are all too real. And now this isn't just like a Western novel, and it's not even a story. It's really a descent into history, into violence, and into the darkest corners of human nature, as we'll go through the story. Now, there's a lot of reasons I wanted to cover this book. One of them being the brutal historical backdrop it paints so vividly. The way that Cormac McCarthy writes this is it's masterful, honestly. And there's also the chance to place yourself in the dust-covered boots of these characters and to feel what they felt, right? Living in that era compared to what we live in today, completely different when you read this book. And of course, the reputation that it has. It's so raw, disturbing, and often sometimes called one of the greatest American novels ever written. Obviously, that's very subjective, but I'll let you be the judge once we get past this story. And even if you read it yourself, you might see why some people say that. Now, but more than anything, what stuck with me the most was this question that it forces you to confront. And it's basically, what can a human being endure? And what do we become when the structures of law, morality, and law all fall away? Blood Meridian is set in the 19th century, but the question it raises about violence, power, and the nature of man are just as relevant today as they were when this was written, right? When things were less civil. But it just puts on a different mask, a different face. While we have become more civilized, so has the violence and the power structure of the message of this book has also adapted with us. Now, before we get into the story, before we actually dive into the story of Blood Meridian, there are a couple of things that I want to point out first, so that way you can follow the story a lot better. First, a plot of the story so you know what you're getting yourself into, because it is a little difficult to just pick up this book and start reading because it's written in such a different way than most other novels. And there's not really like a clear storyline in this. It kind of just jumps around, and the way it's written, it gets kind of confusing. It's very philosophical. So let me just help you out a little bit. So Blood Meridian follows an unnamed teenager, also known as the Kid. And yeah, he doesn't have a name. That is his name in the book. It's the Kid, and then later on, the Man, which we'll get into. He drifts through the brutal, lawless borderlands of the American Southwest. He joins a real-life scalp hunting expedition led by Captain John Joel Glanton, which devolves into a blood-soaked nightmare across the desert. And along the way, he encounters one of the most influential and probably the most terrifying characters in all literature, Judge Holden. And at its core, the novel's a meditation of violence, war, destiny, morality, and really the nature of evil, right back in the day. It subverts the traditional Western by exposing the brutal realities behind the American frontier myth. Now, with that, the main character that we need to know about is actually nameless, like I talked about before. You just know him as the Kid. You never actually know his name. And I don't know the reason behind this or why Cormac McCarthy did that. There's probably a lot of reasons. And even though it is a historical fiction, it is actually based on the Glanton gang, which was a real gang, a real group of scalp hunters in the late 1840s. They were basically contracted by Mexican authorities or the Mexican government to kill Apaches, but quickly descended into mass murder, basically killing anybody, even peaceful Mexicans and Native Americans, for profit. Because the way it worked out was the Mexican government said, hey, if you go get us scalps from the Native Americans because we want their land or we want to fight them off, we'll give you $100 per scalp. And they kind of had the incentive of like, okay, it doesn't really matter what scalp because you can't tell if it's Native American or not. We're just going to start killing everybody and anybody we can just to make a profit from it. Now, the next thing that you need to know is the other character. One of the most extremely important to point out is Judge Holden, or the Judge, as he's referred to in this book. Possibly one of the most famous and diabolical fiction characters ever created. He possibly could be a real man, right? In this book, he's probably a little more exaggerated than what he could have been in real life. But he's described as this like towering, hairless, and highly intelligent man who is a professional killer and Glanton's second in command, which he could easily be first, but there's some interesting theories as to why he wanted to stay second. Again, we'll get that in the story. And McCarthy turns him into like this mythical figure. He's not really just Judge Holden. He's kind of like a blend of a man, a monster, and possibly a symbol for violence and war. And if you read or plan to read this book after this episode, I think it's important to note that McCarthy didn't use any quotation marks or anything like that. It's very different from many other things. Like whenever you're writing a book and there's dialogue between characters, like he said, she said type stuff, there's no quotation marks, there's no nothing. You'll just be reading it, and then you'll kind of notice that like, oh, like I'm actually like people are talking back and forth. And so what I did, what I think is really helpful, is read the book while also listening to the audible version narrated by like Richard Poe at the same exact time, because it helps you kind of decipher who's talking, when it's dialogue, when all that type of stuff. So it is a little hard to kind of read the first time around. So just a little heads up on that. And lastly, I got to explain the title. All right. So this book dives into some very disturbing visuals and storytelling. So much so that even though it has been attempted to be made into a movie, it's been abandoned for many various reasons. Sometimes it is so difficult to get the visuals and the storytelling of the book onto screen. And then there's just a lot of other like little background things that just the movie, it's never been made. And as of right now, it can't be made. And even people like Ridley Scott, Tommy Lee Jones, and James Franco have all had a crack at it, but they can't. And as of right now, as of recording this, there is actually a plan to make this a movie in 2026 by director John Hillcoat. He's in the process of bringing the film to life. And he's actually the one who made The Road, which is another one of McCarthy's books. And McCarthy died in 2023, and his son basically was like, yo, we need to make this into a movie. So I'll give you every resource, I'll give you all the rights, and we'll make this into a movie. So as of right now, the movie has not been filmable for many reasons. And I'm sure a lot of the visuals and the storytelling in this just simply can't make it on screen. And another reason is because it's a very dense and philosophical book, to where I don't even think you'd be able to fit into a 2 or maybe 3 hour movie. I think what you would have to do is make it into like a 5-part series, maybe an hour each, like a limited series type thing where it extends 5 or 6 hours, because the story is just so dense and there's so many things that need to be included in the story to get the full scope of it. So, that's where the title comes from. That's where it stems. But maybe in a couple of years, by 2026, it will be made into a movie, and then I'll have to change the title. But now let's actually get into the book. Everything that you've wanted to watch this video on, right? I just wanted to give you that preface because I think it's important to understand a little bit behind the book before we just get into the story. So the background around the scene of the book, right? It kind of takes place around technically 1833 when the kid is born, but a lot of the action is like late 1840s, early 1850s time era. And this is, the region of it is like the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Think of like Texas, Chihuahua, Sonora, Arizona areas, right? The Mexican-American War, and what I have here is 1846 to 1848. It's just ended, and the U.S. has sieged huge territories from Mexico, including Texas, California, and much of the Southwest. Now, the region, in reality, became a power vacuum of lawless, violent, and full of displaced people, ex-soldiers, drifters, indigenous tribes, and a lot of opportunity for people to go in to this lawless land and basically take what they want by force. And that's exactly what happened. And in response, both the Mexican and local governments hired mercenary scalp hunters like the Glanton gang, which again was in real life, to kill Apaches. But many of these gangs actually just started murdering indiscriminately for bounty, because you get $100 per scalp. Nobody could tell if it's from an Apache tribe or whatever. And so they just started killing everybody that they could just for money. And that's also the same gang in this book as it was in real life that the judge and the kid become a part of, which we'll talk about. And what's interesting, before we get into the first paragraph of the first chapter, there is a guy in real life, Samuel Chamberlain, who actually was a part of the Glanton gang in their heyday. And he wrote a book called My Confession, The Recollections of a Rogue. And it's said that McCarthy actually used what was written in that book to make Blood Meridian. And so I'm sure a lot of the stories that are portrayed in here were probably in that book. I haven't read it yet, so I can't confirm, but I would imagine that he used some of what he said, considering that he was in the actual Glanton gang and probably wrote about the stuff he saw. If you have read the book, then let me know down below in the comments or something. I'd be very interested to read it as part of the series. But let's actually get in the book. Yeah, I'm sure you guys are itching for it, and let's get right into it. So this first part is the first paragraph of the book. See the child. He is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. He stokes the scullery fire. Outside lie dark turned fields of rags of snow and darker woods beyond the harbor, yet a few last wolves. His folk are known of hewers of wood and drawers of water, but in truth his father has become a schoolmaster. He lies in drink. He quotes from poets whose names are now lost. The boy crouches by the fire and watches him. Night of your birth, 33. The Leonidas they were called. God, how the stars did fall. I looked for blackness, holes in the heavens, the dipper stove. The mother dead these 14 years did incubate in her own bosom the creature that would carry her off. The father never speaks her name, and the child does not know it. He has a sister in this world that he will not see again. He watches, pale and unwashed. He can neither read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. All history present in that visage. The child, the father of the man. At 14, he runs away. And so immediately we're introduced into the main character of the stories, the kid. He's never given a name, and that's what he's referenced throughout the entire book. Why? I don't know. Maybe McCarthy does this for a reason, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But what we know so far is that he was born in 1833 in Tennessee. His mother dies from giving birth. His dad's a drunk, and then he has a sister that he'll never see again. And this is an important part to understand here. He watches pale and unwashed. He neither can read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. And you're going to see this play out as he goes out into that lawless land out west, down south. And so again, why does Cormac McCarthy leave him unnamed? Not sure. My guess is that the kid resembles more than just the individual in this story. It could be because he shows more of a universal depiction of how many kids endured this kind of a lifestyle and were shaped by this kind of a war. But again, I'm just speculating. And then at 14, the kid runs away and heads west. We're really south, but right southwest. So then we pick up in the book, the kid heads west and is essentially jumping from job to job, from town to town, aimlessly living with no purpose. He's just drinking, fighting, wandering around. And the areas, from my understanding, of the areas are like present-day New Orleans, Nacogdoches. Nacogdoches is what's used in the book, but I think it's like the New Orleans area right on the coast. And one night in a saloon, he gets in an altercation with a Maltese boatswain, which is basically just a ship officer, right? So they're talking back and forth, they're talking shit to each other, and then the guy gets pissed and he shoots the kid in the back, a 14-year-old kid, right? He's already at a bar, he shoots him in the back. And as the kid turns around to see, what the fuck's going on, then he shoots him again and it hits him just under the heart. 14-year-old kid in a bar, gets in a fight with an older man, gets shot twice, and then this comes up. The man flees and he leans against the bar with the blood running out of his shirt. The others look away. And this is just a small glimpse into the more horrifying story that we're about to get into. It's the soulless landscape that the story takes place into. I mean, you have this 14-year-old kid who's just shot twice in a saloon or in a bar, and then the dude just runs away, and then everyone's just kind of like looking at him like, well, shit, sorry, like, kind of out of luck. Luckily for him, though, eventually the tavern keeper's wife takes the kid upstairs, eventually nurses him back to health, and after 2 weeks of caring for him, the kid decides that with no money and no way of repaying her, he once again runs off in the middle of the night. Quote, only now the child finally divested of all that he has been. His origins have become remote as his destiny, and not again in all the world's turning will there be terrain so wild and barbarous to try whether the stuff of creation may be shaped to man's will, or whether his own heart or not of another kind of clay. So this passage marks basically the symbolic rebirth. He's stripped of his past, his identity, any lingering innocence, and then he's entering the violent world as this 14-year-old kid. And so then he starts heading his way down to Nacogdoches, which I think he's, like I said, in New Orleans, and now he's kind of starting to go southwest type area, right? Like we talked about Texas, Arizona area over there. And so he's walking, and then he gets into Nacogdoches and he sees this tent revival going on. He's like, all right, let me see what it's all about. And then he goes in, and it's where this reverend has been preaching for the last 2 weeks. And it's just really like this massive tent. Think of like a circus tent. And it's full of people. And he's been preaching for the last 2 weeks to these people. And it smells like wet dogs and poor odor and stuff like that. And then the kid wanders in, starts listening. And then moments later, a figure steps into the tent. A man who is impossible to ignore. Quote, an enormous man dressed in an oilcloth slicker had entered the tent and removed his hat. He was bald as a stone, and he had no trace of beard, and he had no brows to his eyes, nor lashes to them. He was close onto 7 feet in height, and he stood smoking a cigar even in this nomadic house of God, and he seemed to have removed his hat only to chase the rain from it as he now put it on again. And this is the judge. And I mean, what a description that we get, right? I'm going to use some descriptions that we get later in the story to kind of paint the picture of him now so you really know what he is. He's basically this 7-foot albino, hairless brute of a man. And the way that I pictured him was, imagine Bane from Batman with no mask. It's kind of how I see him, right? But taller and more hairless. A little daunting, right? And so as soon as the judge walks into the tent, he doesn't just catch the attention of the kid, he catches the attention of the entire tent. Because the reverend stops preaching, the kid's looking at him, and everyone's looking at him. And it's all silent. And then the judge speaks up. And let me preface this. I've been practicing a Bane voice. I really wanted him to have this kind of like maniacal, like Bane voice to him because I think it would suit him. I tried it out. I didn't want to butcher it, and I didn't want like a 2-3 hour podcast of just a shitty accent. So I'm just going to do kind of like my own little accent for him, but I wish I could do a really good Bane one. But here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it is my duty to inform you that the man holding this revival is an impostor. He holds no papers of divinity from any institution recognized or improvised. He is altogether devoid of the least qualifications to the office he has usurped, and only committed to memory a few passages from the good book for the purpose of lending his fraudulent sermons some faint flavor of the piety he despises. In truth, the gentleman standing here before you, posing as a minister of the Lord, is not only totally illiterate, but also wanted by the law in the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Arkansas. Oh God, cried the Reverend. Lies, lies, he began reading feverishly from his open Bible, on a variety of charges of the most recent, which involved the girl of 11 years, I said 11, who had come in him in trust, and whom he had surprised in the act of violating, while actually clothed in the livery of his God. And he continues on, and he basically is saying, like, this man's wanted in multiple states. He had, things going on with an 11-year-old girl, and he even says that he had sex with a goat, and he keeps going on and on and on. And then eventually, one man stands up, and he goes on to say, well, damn my eyes if I won't shoot the son of a bitch. He then pulls out a pistol, levels it, and fires it at the Reverend. And then from there, all hell breaks loose. Everyone starts pulling out knives and guns and starts wreaking havoc in the tent. Doesn't really matter whose side you're on. You're either getting shanked, shot at, stabbed, or whatever, unless you leave the tent. Luckily for the kid, him and a couple people escape by cutting a hole in the tent and escaping to a nearby saloon. And as he's running away, he looks back at the tent and he sees the entire tent shaking and finally collapsing on itself with the dead inside. And finally, most of the survivors from the tent, including the kid and the judge, end up back at the saloon. And this is where a bunch of the people come up to the judge and they want to ask him some questions. He says some of the people go to the judge and are so shocked as to how he knew the Reverend was a wicked man. Judge, How did you come to have the goods on that no account? Goods, said the judge. When you was in Fort Smith. Fort Smith. Where did you know him to know all that stuff on him? You mean the Reverend Green? Yes, sir. I reckon you was in Fort Smith before ye come out here. I was never in Fort Smith in my life. Doubt he was. They looked at one another. Well, where was it you run up on him? I never laid eyes on that man before today. Never even heard of him. He raised his glass and drank. There was a strange silence in the room. The men looked like mud effigies. Finally, someone began to laugh, and then another. Soon they were all laughing together, and someone bought the judge a drink. How crazy is that? I mean, the judge, this maniacal 7-foot albino man comes in the tent and is basically like, this reverend has been sleeping with an 11-year-old girl. He had sex with a goat, and he gets everyone so riled up that they eventually shoot him. And then after all this, they go to the saloon and they're basically like, how did you know all this stuff on the guy and the reverend? He's like, I don't even know who you're talking about. He's like, I kind of just made that all up to see what you guys would do. And that's the introduction to the judge. That's the first scene that we have with the judge, right? Comes in the tent revival, does all this stuff, and then basically at the bar, he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And one really interesting takeaway from this, we'll talk about this in the next episode, because the next episode, this is mainly the story, and the next one that I want to make is more on like the lessons that I learned. But an interesting takeaway I got from this is how simple it is to trick people into thinking stuff like this. Now, this is obviously back in the 1850s, right? And it was just people's word that you were going based off. But now today, it's kind of the same, but on the internet. You could say something so crazy, so out of it. And if you just get one person to believe, eventually it starts churning and churning and churning. And that's how we come up with things like conspiracy theories or when people start to believe basically anything on the internet. What is happening in 1850 is basically the same thing that's happening now, just in a different medium. And it's so interesting how easy it is to fool some people sometimes. But by this point, it's been raining for about 16 days straight. The kid has stayed in this town, and he goes out to one of the outhouses. But since it's been raining for so long, and again, remember this is the 1850s, really no paved roads. And so what they have is it's mud everywhere. And so they have these little 2x4s that are going out to the outhouses, but it really only fits one person there, right? And so as he's walking to the outhouse, there's another guy walking in the opposite direction towards him. And eventually they meet up with each other, and they both look at each other. Again, this is the 14-year-old kid and a grown man. And the man in this depiction, he's got no ears. I think he has like dreadlocks and just kind of looks like a gangster, right? Someone like that would just kill you on the spot. And they're both looking at each other like, you better move because I'm not moving. Neither of them move. And they start fighting to the point where they take out their knives, literally like they're about to kill each other because they wouldn't move off of the little plank to get to the outhouse. And so as they're fighting, they probably would have killed each other. I mean, the older man probably would have killed the kid. But then this guy comes out of nowhere with a bat, knocks both of them out. And then eventually they wake up in this hotel room together. And the craziest thing is that this man and the kid who were fighting each other, man is called Toadvine. We'll see him later in the story. They both wake up in this room together. And it's, instead of continuing to fight each other, they both literally just introduce each other and trade their possessions back to each other. Like, oh, is this your knife? Is this my boot? Like nothing happened. And so as they're leaving the hotel, Toadvine sees a man that owes him money. And he asks the kid if he wanted to help beat this guy up, right? They're leaving. They're going to go their separate ways. And the guy's like, hey, that dude owes me money. Like, you want to beat the shit out of him? And he's like, sure, let's do it. And so the kid, with a knack for mindless violence, right? We're seeing it now. They follow this man up to his room. And to get him out of his room, he tells the kid to light something on fire and then stick it under the door. So the guy will have to open it, put out the fire, and then they'll attack him. And eventually the guy does open up the door. And it says, he stood in his underwear, holding in one hand the towel he used to turn the doorknob with. When he saw them, he turned back and started back into his room. But Toadvine seized him about the neck and rode him to the floor and held him by his hair and began to pry open an eyeball with his thumb. The man grabbed his wrist and bit it. Kick his mouth in, said Toadvine. Kick it. The kid stepped past them in the room and turned and kicked the man in the face. Toadvine held his head back by the hair. Kick him, he called. Aw, kick him, honey. Toadvine pulled the bloody head around and looked at it and let it flop to the floor as he rose and kicked the man himself. 2 spectators were standing in the hallway. The door was completely afire, a part of the wall and the ceiling. They went out and down the hall. The clerk was coming up the stairs 2 at a time. And so let's just recap. Just moments ago, Toadvine and the kid were literally trying to kill each other because they were walking on the same plank and they wanted to kill each other for that. Then they joined together and almost killed another guy together without really even knowing who each other were, while at the same time setting the entire hotel on fire. And then they make the escape from the hotel and then just run off. So they beat this guy to death, set the hotel on fire, and then just leave. And it says, when he passed back through the town, the hotel was burning and the men were standing around watching it, some holding empty buckets. A few men sat horseback watching the flames, as one of them was the judge. As the kid rode past the judge, he turned and watched him. He turned the horse as if he'd watched the animal watch him too. When the kid looked back, the judge smiled. The kid touched up the mule and they went sucking out past the old stone fort along the road west. So now in the book, the kid is, again, continuing to head west without really any meaning to his life, right? He's just kind of heading west, just to head west. Now, this part's pretty quick. I wanted to include it because it has a super important message written in it. So again, as the boy's heading west towards San Antonio on his mule, he comes across an old man and stays with him the night. Remember, the kid just came from burning down a hotel. But as he's heading west, again, it's not civilized here, right? You can go for miles and miles and miles and not see anybody. And so whenever you come up on a house or a little civilization, you kind of take advantage of it. So the kid stays with this old man, and at night, the old man is talking to him, and this is what he says. He says, "I," said the old man, "but where does a man come by his notions? What world's he seen that he liked better? I can think of a better place and better ways. Can ye make it be? No, no. It's a mystery. A man's at odds to know his mind, 'cause his mind is aught he has to know it with. He can know his heart, but he doesn't want to. Rightly so. Best not look in there. It ain't the heart of a creature that is bound in the way that God has set for it. You can find meanness in the least of creatures. But when God made man, the devil was at his elbow, a creature that can do anything, make a machine, and a machine to make the machine, and an evil that can run itself 1,000 years. No need to tend to it. You believe that?" So this is what the old man was saying to the kid. And let me break it down for you, because this is kind of how things are written in Blood Meridian, right? It took me a couple times, and I really had to go back through it. And when they're talking about this dialogue, there's a lot of philosophical meaning in this. And this is why it's very difficult to just read this book once over and really understand what's going on, because it takes a lot of, it's very dense, right? And so the hermit, a reclusive figure, is speaking to the kid. It's an old man. But really, he's speaking kind of truth that the entire book wrestles with. It's the nature of man, evil, and self-awareness. And this passage is about the unique terror of human nature. Animals can be violent, but their violence is limited. Humans can scale violence into civilizations, war machines, ideologies, history, all of it. And we distract ourselves, we justify it, we blame others. But the heart knows, and we don't want to look at it. And this passage lays the groundwork for Blood Meridian's central thesis. Man is not evil because he breaks the rules of nature. Man is evil because he is free. And freedom, unmoored from conscience, creates horror. So to kind of get back to the plot, as the kid wandering about aimlessly is kind of just picking spots to go. There's really no reason behind it, but he finally gets to San Antonio, or what it says here is Bexar. So think of it as like San Antonio in modern day. He finds himself in another saloon after traveling for about 4 days. He has no money and just wants a drink, right? Imagine just traveling with your mule just by yourself in the dead of Texas, in the middle of nowhere on a mule, and it's summer, and it's just hot, right? And so he goes up to the barman and starts asking for a drink, but explains that he has no money. Immediately, he finds out that the bartender knows no English, or he just pretends that he doesn't. And so the kid starts begging for some liquor. He's like, "Come on, man, like just give me a drink. Like, I'm thirsty, I have no money, just give me something." Then he says, "You know what? I'll even work for some liquor." Eventually, he picks up a broom and then starts sweeping the place. He sweeps most of the place, and the bartender and everyone around is kind of just watching him. They're like, "What the fuck is this kid doing?" And so he comes back to the barman and is like, "Look, I swept up your entire place. I worked. Now let me just get a little bit of liquor." And still, the barman denies him. He's like, no, I'm not going to give you any liquor. Or at least that's probably what he's saying, right? It's in Spanish. Like in the book, it's actually in Spanish. I had to translate some of it in ChatGPT. But then he says, and then they start kind of getting frustrated with each other at this point because the kid's speaking English, the bartender's speaking Spanish, and they just don't understand each other. But the barman's like, I'm not giving you liquor, kid. And so the barman picks up a pistol and starts waving it for him to leave. He's basically like, get the fuck out of here. He's like, I'm not giving you any liquor. I'm not giving you anything. Like, go on. So eventually the bartender thinks he scares off the kid. He puts the pistol back on the bar, and then he walks around to basically serve everybody else in his establishment. And eventually the kid jumps over the counter and takes the gun, and then everyone goes silent, waiting to see what the kid will do next. And then it says, the barman stood in the center of the room. He was breathing heavily and he turned, following the kid's movements. When the kid approached him, he raised the bung starter, the gun. The kid crouched lightly with the bottles and fainted and then broke one over the right man's head. Blood and liquor sprayed and the man's knees buckled and his eyes rolled. So at this point, the kid took one of the bottles. He has the gun. He's got a bottle of liquor and he just smashes it over the bartender's head. The kid had already let go of the bottleneck, and he pitched the second bottle into his right hand in a road agent's pass before it even reached the floor, and he backhanded the second bottle across the barman's skull and crammed the jagged remnant into his eye as he went down. The kid looked around the room. Some of those men wore pistols in their belts, but none moved. The kid vaulted the bar and took another bottle and tucked it under his arm and walked out the door. The dog was gone. The man on the bench was gone too. He untied the mule and led it across the square. So literally what we have here is the kid finally makes it to San Antonio, gets into a saloon, and then basically just gets into an altercation with the bartender because the bartender won't give him any liquor. And so he jumps over, he grabs bottles of liquor, and he has the gun. And everyone in the saloon too. You got to remember, like, this is not just him and the bartender, it's a bunch of other people. Remember when the kid was shot and nobody did anything? It's the same exact thing here. They're just kind of watching this play out, and they're like, look, if you don't fuck with me, I won't fuck with you. But the kid hits the bartender over the head. He goes down, and before he even hits the floor, it says that he hits him again with another thing and then stabs the piece of glass in the bartender's eye, mutilating him, jumps back over the bar, grabs his liquor, and then he's just like, all right, this is all I wanted. This is all I came for, right? You didn't give it to me, so I took it. So obviously the kid, he's probably thinking, he's like, okay, well, I can probably stay in the area, but I can't really stay in this exact area because I just killed a man over a bottle of liquor. So maybe I should go somewhere not so close to the bar. And so he spends the night under like some trees. He's still in the town in San Antonio. And then there's a guy that is walking down the path and then basically sees the kid, and then he's basically just like, hey, can I ask you some questions? So he gets woken up by the man on a horse asking him some questions. Why don't you go on and leave me the hell alone? Just wanted to talk to ye. Didn't intend to get you all riled up. Well, you done got me riled up. What was the feller that knocked into the Mexican's head yesterday evening? I ain't the law. Who wants to know? Captain White. He wants to sign the feller up to join the army. The army? Yes, sir. What army? Company under Captain White. We going to whip up the Mexicans. The war's over. He says it ain't over. So basically what's happening here is the kid spends the night under these rocks or these trees, right? He's just sleeping there, and then one guy is basically just trying to find who killed this bartender, right? Because if he's willing to kill the bartender, he's willing to work for us, and we're trying to. It's like the filibusters. It's like the Glanton gang, but this is like Captain White's gang. I don't know if he was a real gang in real life, but yeah, it's just like another gang that's trying to do that stuff. And so the kid agrees to go meet Captain White to get recruited to his army. He wants to see what this is all about, right? He's got nothing to do, and so he's going to go see this army. And when the kid meets Captain White, he tells him that he's looking for fighters to join the army. And he wants people who aren't afraid of violence and killing. It's perfect for the kid, right? And then the kid asks, what are you doing this for? And then Captain White leaned back and folded his arms. What are we dealing with, he said, is a race of degenerates, a mongrel race, little better than N-words, right? This book uses a lot of racist terms, so I'm not going to say them, but A little better than N-words. And maybe no better. There's no government in Mexico. Hell, there's no God in Mexico. Never will be. We are dealing with a people manifestly incapable of governing themselves. And how do you know? And this is really important. Like this sentence is super important. And how do you know what happens with people who cannot govern themselves? That's right. Others come in and govern for them. It's such an important line. It's so much applicable today as to when it was written. Then he goes on to say, there are already some 14,000 French colonists in the state of Sonora. They're being given free land to settle. They're being given the tools and livestock. Enlightened Mexicans encourage this. Paredes is already calling the secession from the Mexican government. They'd rather be ruled by toad-eaters than thieves and imbeciles. And so here's what's happening. Here's what's going down. Captain White is this delusional, self-styled military man, part of a real 19th century American phenomenon known as the filibusters, or filibustering. It's where private citizens, usually white Americans, launched unauthorized military expeditions into Latin countries, aiming to conquer their land and to establish new republics, eventually annexing them back into the U.S. And that a lot of this is led by people who were in the military, and then they went off to do their own thing because it was just less rules, and they kind of just do whatever they wanted. And so he's claiming a crusade into Mexico, but really what he's trying to do is just steal their land by force. But he's saying, look, I mean, the Mexican people, they want me to do this, right? Because they can't govern themselves, so I will do it for them. And then we're just going to take their land. So he's essentially claiming to be a savior of Mexico, and he justifies this invasion by pointing to others like the French, like, look, they're already doing it. And then he paints Mexico as a failed state. It's too corrupt and too stupid to govern itself. And then he claims the moral superiority, right? That Americans, even as vigilantes, would bring order and civilization because the Mexican people can't do it. And then he appeals to greed, right? Not only that, but then we get the land, we get the loot, and then we get the adventure of lawlessness, violence, and killing. And then he wraps it all up in patriotism. It's not a conquest, it's destiny. It's what we're supposed to do. And so you kind of got this like delusional guy who's just like on this expedition of like, he's trying to paint this picture of like, look, we're doing good for the Mexican people, but really, I just want land and I want to kill people. And do you want to be in my army? That's really what's going down at this point. So the kid, not having much purpose in life, agrees to set out on this journey with the filibusters and Captain White's gang. They go off on their journey into a town called Laredo, and eventually, as ritual, the kid and the filibusters decide to make a stop into a saloon for a drink, right? You're going to see this play out a lot. They go to a lot of bars. And when they're inside, this old man notices them and starts speaking to them. They'll stop you at the river, he says. The second corporal looks past his comrades. You talking to me? At the river. Be told they'll jail you a man. Who will? United States Army, General Worth. The hell they will. Pray that they will. He looks at his comrades. He leans towards the Mennonite. What does that mean, old man? Do ye cross that river with yon filibuster armed? You'll not cross it back. Don't aim to cross it back. We going to Sonora. What's it to you, old man? The Mennonite watches the enshadowed dark before them as it reflected to him in the mirror over the bar. He turns to them. His eyes are wet, and he speaks slowly. The wrath of God lies sleeping. It was hid 1,000,000 years before men were, and only men have the power to wake it. Hell ain't full yet. Hear me. Ye carry war of a madman's making unto a foreign land. You'll wake more than the dogs. So as the filibusters are posted up in the saloon, they get this eerie warning from one of the locals. He's foreshadowing at the fact that if they decide to go on their journey, they're going to wake the wrath of God, right? And hell ain't half full yet. And the filibusters seemed a little disgraced by this notion that the old man's warning. He's like, do you know who we are? We are a Captain White's gang. We are going to do our destiny. We're going to take this land, going to make some money, and going to kill some people. And so much that they eventually told the old man off, kept drinking through the night, and then they went on their way with their mission. But again, this is a little bit of foreshadowing. They rode well armed, each man with a rifle and many with the small bore 5-shot Colt revolvers. The captain carried a pair of dragoon pistols in scabbards and mounted across the pommel of the saddle so that they rode at each knee. These guns were United States issue Colt's patent, and he had brought them from a deserter in the Soledad livery stable and paid $80 in gold for them, and the scabbards and the mold of the flask that they came with. Now, to give you a sense, it's around 46 men in this little army that they had just gathered up. And it's just random people. I mean, think about it. They recruited the kid. He's a 15, maybe 16-year-old kid at this point. They're just like, look, if anybody wants to kill, like, come join this army. They wrangled up about 46 people in this army. And so they start to set foot, they start going out west. But as they're going out west, before they even meet anyone to fight, they're already suffering death blows just from this brutal trip alone. And you'll see this throughout the story. But if you read the book, you'll see, like, how crazy it was to travel, because you got to think about it. They're literally on mules and horses, and they're traveling hundreds of miles through the desert in the south in the summer. And what they have to go through is basically traveling for multiple days without food, without water, and without shelter. And so it goes on to say, on this day, 2 men fell sick and one died before dark. In the morning, there was another ill to take his place. The 2 of them were laid among sacks of beans and rice and coffee in the supply wagon with blankets over them to keep them from the sun, and they rode with the slamming and jarring of the wagon, half shearing the meat from their bones so that they cried out to be left, and then they died. The men turned out in the early morning darkness to dig their graves with the blade bones of the antelope that they covered them with stones and rode on again. They rode on, and the sun in the east flushed pale streaks of light, and then a deeper run of color, like blood seeping upon sudden, reaches flaring plain-wise, and where the earth drained up into the sky at the edge of creation, the top of the sun rose out of nothing, like the head of a great red phallus, until it cleared the unseen rim and sat squat and pulsing and malevolent behind them. Sorry if it's a little hard to read sometimes, because when Cormac McCarthy writes some of this stuff, it is a very long run-on sentence, so there are no periods. Like, sometimes, I mean, you'll see, like, if you read this book, it could be a whole page where it's just, like, literally a run-on sentence, right? That's maybe a couple periods, but he just keeps going and going. But he's really masterful in creating the landscape of this crazy place, this lawless, blood-soaking place that they're going into. And so for days, they end up going traveling in this blistering heat all day, and then they try to stay warm when the sun goes down. And they go from losing men to illness and starvation during this trip. And the trip alone was torture. It goes on to say, all night the wind blew and the fine dust set their teeth on edge, sand in everything, grit in all they ate. In the morning, a urine-colored sun rose barely through panes of dust on a dim world without feature. The animals were failing. They halted and made a dry camp without wood or water, and the wretched ponies huddled and whimpered like dogs. Now, eventually, they come across this little village, but by the time that they make it there, it looks like it's already been abandoned. But it seems like someone was still there because there were still hot coals burning. So it seemed like they saw them coming and then they fled. So they have this village with really nobody in it. And then they see off in the distance hundreds of cattle being mended by about maybe a dozen or so Indians. And they're kind of looking, they can kind of see out in the distance, and they're like, it's just a bunch of cattle, maybe a dozen Indians. We got 46 guys here. We're totally good. We're fine. But the cattle are coming their way. So the cattle and a dozen or so Indians are traveling in their direction, but again, they pay no mind to it. That is, until they finally get close enough and realize that hiding behind these hundreds of cattle, masterfully done, are hundreds of Indians among these cattle that they can only now see, but it is too late. So from a far distance, they see like maybe a dozen or so Indians, and they're coming their way, and they're like, all right, whatever. But behind the cattle, behind all of these animals, were hundreds of Indians just slowly coming in, slowly coming in. And so they probably saw these 46 men coming into town. They fled out, and then they staked in ambush. And then it goes on to say, "Oh my God," said the sergeant. A rattling drove of arrows passed through the company, and men tottered and dropped from their mounts. Horses were rearing and plunging, and the Mongol horde swung up along their flanks and turned and rode full upon them with lances. The company was now come to a halt, and the first shots were fired, and the gray rifle smoke rolled through the dust as the lancers breached their ranks. The kid's horse sank beneath him with a long pneumatic sigh. He had already fired his rifle, and now he sat on the ground and fumbled with his shot pouch. Riding down the unhorsed Saxons and spearing and clubbing them and leaping from their mounts with knives and running about on the ground with a peculiar bandy-legged trot like creatures driven from alien forms of locomotion, and stripping the clothes from the dead and seizing them up by their hair and passing their blades about the skulls of the living and the dead alike. and snatching aloft the bloody wigs and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the strange white torsos, and holding up great handfuls of viscera, genitals. Some of the savages so slathered up the gore that they might have rolled in it like dogs, and some who fell upon the dying and sodomized them with loud cries to their fellows. And now the horses of the dead came pounding out of the smoke and dust, encircled with flapping leather and wild manes, and eyes whitened with fear like the eyes of the blind, and some were feathered with arrows, and some lanced through, and stumbling and vomiting blood as they wheeled across the killing ground and clattered from sight again. Dust stanched the wet and naked heads of the scalped, who with the fringe of hair below their wounds, and tonsured to the bone, now lay like maimed and naked monks, and their blood slaked dust, and everywhere the dying groaned, and the gibbered, and horses lay screaming. So, quite a depiction here of what just happened. And within moments, the entire company of Captain White's army was absolutely obliterated. And you get this really dense and visual of like what these Indians did to Captain White's army. They literally scalped, dismembered everything, torsos, limbs, genitals, wiped it all over themselves. Like they were brutal to these guys. Somehow the kid and a couple of others miraculously survived by playing dead among the dozens of other bodies scattered around them. And once the Indians were kind of done and, they went away with their massacre, and the kid and a couple others were like, oh shit, we got to get out of here. And so they ran off. And once the massacre was done, the kid and another man named Sproul took a foot and traveled away from the wreckage. They traveled for a few days until they came across a village similar to the one that they had when the massacre started. It says, they followed the trampled ground left by the war party, and in the afternoon they came upon a mule that had failed, been lanced, and left dead, and then came up another. The way narrowed through the rocks, and by they came to a bush that was hung by dead babies. So they're walking, they find a mule, they keep going, and you could assume that it was done by the Indians, but there's literally just dead babies hanging from a tree, right? So they stopped by side, reeling in the heat. These small victims, 7 or 8 of them, had holes punched in their underjaws and were hung so by their throats from the broken stobs of the mesquite to stare eyeless at the naked sky, bald and pale and bloated, larval in some unreckonable thing. The castaways hobbled past, and they looked back. Nothing moved. In the afternoon they came upon a village on the plain where smoke still rose from the ruins, and all were gone to death. From a distance it looked like a decaying brick kiln. They stood without the walls for a long time, listening to the silence before they entered. They went slowly through the little mud streets. There were goats and sheep slain in their pens, and pigs dead in the mud. They passed mud hovels where people lay and murdered in all altitudes death, in the doorways and the floors, naked and swollen and strange. So they stayed here one night, betting that the Indians wouldn't circle back to the massacre of the town, looking for more people. And so literally what just happened to Captain Dwight's army, as they go on to travel, they find another little village, and it's exactly what just happened to Captain Dwight's army, but basically to the people that were living there. And literally, I mean, as you heard, like they were literally hanging babies from trees by their jaws. They just completely taken out the entire village, and they're like, we're going to take the risk. The Indians aren't going to come back to this little village. We're going to stake out here. And then when the sun rises, then we'll continue to move. So as they continued on their way, they traveled miles on foot looking for any kind of civilization. Well, really anyone that wasn't an Indian at this point. So they crested the mountain at sunset, and they could see for miles. An immense lake lay below them in the distant blue mountains, standing in the wildness span of water, in the shape of a soaring hawk, and trees that shimmered in the heat, in a distant city, very white against the blue and shaded hills. They sat and watched. They saw the sun drop under the jagged rim of the earth to the west, and they saw it flare behind the mountains. And they saw the face of the lake darken and the shape of the city dissolve upon it. They slept among the rocks, face up, like dead men. And in the morning when they rose, there was no city, no trees, and no lake, only a barren, dusty plain. And so at this point, they're badly hallucinating, right? They're probably days without water, days without eating. But eventually the kid stumbles into Chihuahua, a Spanish colonial city. But instead of salvation, he gets treated like an animal. All right, the kid and the other survivors are herded like livestock through the streets by Mexican soldiers. The townspeople throw garbage at them, jeer at them, mock them, and they're driven through elegant plazas, past fountains, marble benches, and a grand cathedral, which are signs of civilization, but all juxtaposed with horrific imagery. Vultures nesting on Christian statues, scalps of slaughtered Indians flapping like banners. And shortly after this humiliating parade that the kid is taken down, the kid is thrown into jail with all the other people that survived that massacre. And why? Well, possibly because being part of the illegal American incursion, right? Filibustering was illegal. Or maybe it's simply because he was a foreigner, a vagrant, or a threat. And so the Mexicans saw him and they're like, no, we're going to take this kid to jail. So in jail, he meets Toadvine again, right? Another American outlaw. And he recognizes him because Toadvine does not have ears. And remember, Toadvine is the guy that he got into a fight when they burned down that hotel. And now, it's not clear exactly how many days. McCarthy avoids dates a lot of times. But based on the physical condition of the kid and Sproul and the sheer exhaustion that they experience, I'm estimating maybe like 7 to 10 days of desperate wandering is a safe estimate before they reach the town of Chihuahua. So now where we're at in the story is the kid is imprisoned in Chihuahua City after surviving Captain White's failed expedition. He's in jail, reunited with Toadvine. At least he knows somebody who's also survived. The Mexican governor publicly posts a decree offering payment for Apache scalps. And then enter John Glanton, a cold, commanding leader seeking fighters for a scalp hunting contract. Now, remember, the Glanton gang is real, and that's what Cormac McCarthy uses in this story. It's the Glanton gang. And as the Glanton gang and his gang ride into town, there's someone that the kid has seen before. Foremost among them, outsized and childlike with his naked face, rode the judge. His cheeks were ruddy, and he was smiling and bowing to the ladies and doffing his filthy hat. The enormous dome of his head, when he bared it, was blinding white and perfectly circumcised about it so it looked like it had been painted. He and the reeking horde of rabble with him passed on through the stunned streets and hove up before the governor's palace where their leader, a small black-haired man, clapped for entrance by kicking at the oaken doors with his boot. The doors were open. Forthwith they rode in all, and the doors were closed again. And so the judge reappears right here until basically the end of the story, and we are going to get way more from the judge. And I will do my best to capture all of this mythical character, but you got to read the book to really understand absolutely everything about the judge. I mean, there's so much to him, but I'll do my best to do it here. So the Glanton gang selects a group of prisoners, including the kid and Toadvine, to form a scalping party, basically. And the reason that Toadvine and the kid were picked is because Toadvine told the guards that they were exactly what the Glanton gang was looking for. It says, the following day, the judge and the company and the others stood in the streets smoking a cigar, rocking back on their heels. He wore a pair of good kidskin boots, and he was studying the prisoners where they had knelt in the gutter, clutching up the filth with their bare hands. The kid was watching the judge. When the judge's eyes fell upon him, he took the cigar from between his teeth and smiled. Or he seemed to smile. Then he put the cigar between his teeth again. It's like the judge knows exactly where the kid's going to be, and he knew that this was going to happen. But that night, Toadvine called them together, and they crouched by the wall and spoke whispers. His name is Glanton, said Toadvine. He's got a contract with the Trias. They're to pay him $100 for a head of scalps and $1,000 for Gomez's head. I told him that there was 3 of us, gentlemen. We were getting out of this shithole. We ain't got no outfits. He knows that. He said that he'd find anybody that was guaranteed hand and take him out of their shares. So don't let on to be like you ain't no seasoned Indian killer, because I'm claiming that we was the 3 of the best. And so that's basically how they get released to the Glanton gang. He's basically like, Toadvine's like, look, us 3, like, we are Indian killers. Like, we can do what you're looking for. If you need people in your army, we got you. So that's basically how they get into the actual gang. And as the gang begins preparation, arming up, gathering supplies, they ride out into the northwestern front. So now what we have here is the Glanton gang. What we know of it so far is that it's comprised of probably the same amount as Captain White's gang, maybe a few more, but we definitely have Glanton himself, the judge, which again is the second in hand to the Glanton gang, which I think the judge does this on purpose, as we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more philosophically as we get into the story. We have the kid, Toadvine, which is his counterpart when they burned down the hotel, and then a couple other people from prison, and then maybe like 50 to 100 is safe to say. And so right now, the gang is riding through the vast, desolate Mexican north, right? And they're followed and shadowed by distant Apaches, but they're not attacked. They eventually come across a family that are entertainers. The dad's a juggler, he has his wife and his daughter, and they're also with him, and they want to ride with the Glanton gang for protection from the Indians because, as we've seen, they can be pretty brutal, which is ironic, as you'll see here in the story, that they allow this. Now, after traveling all day, they post up in the mountains, light a fire, and share campfire stories. Then the Glanton gangs asked if they could perform for them, right? You've been following us. How about you guys perform? And so they go around the group reading out tarot cards. And so basically what's happening here is the father is he takes out these tarot cards. His wife is kind of like a conduit or a messenger, right? He blindfolds her and she's behind him. And he has these tarot cards, and as he pulls them out to each person around the campfire, he reads them out loud, and then the wife basically becomes like this extraterrestrial like messenger. Like she gets messages that read out the fate of the tarot cards, and they're going around and they're picking tarot cards, and they're basically just saying like, oh, here's your fate, here's your fate, here's your fate. And they go around the fire, and then they eventually get to the kid. It says, the juggler took the boy's hand on his own, and he turned the card so he could see it. Then he took the card and held it up. Cuatro de copas, he called out. Bear with me if my Spanish is off. In tarot symbolism, discontent, apathy, and refusal of insight or opportunity. This fits the kid because he's morally ambiguous, withdrawn, and repeatedly, as you'll see in the story, fails to act decisively against evil, especially against the judge. And the card is saying, Cuatro de copas is 4 cups. And it's basically saying you've been offered something, a choice, a fate, and you may refuse it. And remember this because the story is somewhat foreshadowing and will definitely come back in the story. So remember this. And so he gets the tarot card, 4 of cups. The woman raised her head. Remember, she's blindfolded and behind the guy at this point. The woman raises her head. She looks like a blindfold mannequin raised awake by a string. ¿Quién? Called the juggler. El hombre mos joven, el muchacho. It's basically saying the man, the younger man, the boy, right? It's unmistakably the boy. And she can't see him. So she doesn't really know what's going on. She's just kind of the messenger. And he's been singled out in front of everybody. Everyone's kind of gotten their tarot cards and they've been okay. But then this one gets a little more like diabolical, if that makes sense. And she began to chant, and the judge was laughing silently. The kid looked at Tobin and Glanton himself, but no one else was laughing, just the judge, like this eerily laugh. And everyone's taken aback by this moment, except the judge, who is sitting there laughing. Glanton rose. She raised her jaw, gibbering at the night. Shut her up, said Glanton. Now, Glanton tries to stop the ritual, because at this point, the woman's just like blurting out things and just keeps going and going and going. And then she goes on to say, the old Maribeste, the juggler, was on his knees. Perida, prida, un malefico. A curse. I think I said it right. Maleficio, something like that. It means curse in Spanish. And by God, will you shut her up? Said Glanton, drawing his revolver. Carroza de muertos, llenes de huesos, el joven que. She again references the death coach, right? Now explicably full of bones. She says, in there, the young one, likely the kid, is the one in the vision, which all this is revolving around. And then her lines trail off, and we never know what happens to the young one. It's cut off by something else. And she's basically saying, like, she's envisioning something. It involves the kid, the death, and kind of like a curse. And then the judge, as all this is going on, as she's blabbering, as she's going on, everyone's kind of like freaking out. Glanton's like, shut her up. Like, she's now starting to go crazy, and the kid's freaked out. And then the judge, like a great ponderous djinn, stepped through the fire. And a djinn is a spirit, often associated with fire, trickery, eternity, and destruction. And the fire in this setting delivers him, doesn't harm him. He literally walks through the fire, and it seems like it literally reveals him is like he's native to it. And I think that's the most terrifying part of all this is that the judge is naked. And you'll see through the story that the judge is naked a lot. I don't know why, but just imagine a 7-foot albino brute of a man like Bane from Batman, and he's just always naked for some reason. And then he puts his arms around Glanton. And that is kind of like symbolizing that the curse has been accepted, that the fate has been sealed, and the judge is his hand. And so after this, they're kind of like freaking out. But the main reason that I wanted to add this in, right, I didn't have to, but it's really foreshadowing what's going to happen later here in the story. The kid gets the 4 of cards from the tarot, and it's basically like your fate. You have a choice. You can act against evil, but it's totally up to you. And it's kind of like foreshadowing that the kid is not going to act because he continues to pull away from the tarot cards and he doesn't want to continue to hear this thing. And it's just kind of foreshadowing of what's going to happen later in the story. And so after they continue to go, the gang discovers, they keep traveling and traveling, and then eventually they discover the remains of a destroyed Mexican wagon. And it has scattered corpses, burned wagons, blood everywhere, right? And the judge calmly examines the scene, deducing the tactics used by the attackers, possibly the Indians. That's probably what it was. And then Glanton allows the gang to scalp the heads, despite not having to kill the victims. Now remember, Glanton was sent out by the Mexican officials and local governments to saying, like, go kill these Apaches, go kill the Indians, take their scalps, bring them back, we'll give you $100 for each. What they're doing here is basically just, we're going to scalp anything that we see because we want the money. We have an incentive to just get scalps from anything. And so you're going to start seeing this. They have a job to do, which is to go kill the Indians for the Mexican government. But it quickly evolves into, let's just go kill everybody, right? Because we can go make money for scalping. It doesn't have to be just Indians. It could be Mexicans too. It could be white people. It really doesn't matter. And so it goes on to say, the judge knelt with his knife and cut the strap of the tiger skin war bag the man carried and emptied it into the sand. It held an eye shield made from a raven's wing and a rosary of fruit seeds, a few gun flits, and a handful of lead balls. It held also a callus or mad stone from the inward parts of some beast, and this the judge examined and pocketed. The other effects he spread with the palm of his hands as if they were something to be read there. Then he ripped open the man's drawers with his knife. Tied alongside the dark genitals was a small skin bag, and this the judge cut away and also secured in the pocket of his vest. Lastly, he seized the dark locks and he swept them from the sand and cut away at the scalp. Then they rose and returned, leaving him to scrutinize with his drying eyes in the I don't know how to say that word, honestly. They advanced into the sun. They rode all day upon the gale Gastine sparsely grown with saltbush and panic grass. In the evening they entrained upon a hollow ground that rang so roundly under the horses' hooves that they stepped and sidled and rolled their eyes like circus animals. And that night as they lay in the ground all heard, the dull boom of rock falling somewhere far below them in the awful darkness inside the world. And so here they're looting the corpses and falsifying the killing for the bounty. And this is where like the pattern begins. They kill or scavenge wherever possible to meet the scalp quotas. And so as the Glanton gang continues to travel, they keep posting up in the mountains. And while the kid's working on his weapon, one of the members, the ex-priest, which is his name in the book, went over the kid and started talking to him. And he was praising him because he was saying like, oh, he's a natural. And he's praising the kid that he knows his weapon so well and what he's doing. And he's like, where'd you learn all this? And the kid was like, yeah, right. And the ex-priest was like, yeah, I mean, pretty similar to the judge. I mean, he knows everything. And then the kid's like, well, what do you mean? Like, how does he know everything? Then he tells him about how he knows Spanish, Dutch, and a variety of other languages, which you see kind of throughout the book. Then he goes on to say, the Almighty, the ex-priest shook his head. He glanced across the fire towards the judge. That great hairless thing? You wouldn't think to look at him that he could outdance the devil himself, now could ye? God, the man is a dancer. You'll not take that away from him. And fiddle? He's the greatest fiddler I've ever heard, and that's an end to it. The greatest. He can cut a trail, shoot a rifle, ride a horse, track a deer. He's been all over the world. Him and the governor, they sat up till breakfast, and it was Paris this and London that in 5 languages. You'd have given something to heard them. The governor a learned man himself he is, but the judge? The ex-priest shook his head. Oh, it may be the Lord's way of showing how little store he sets by the learned. Whatever could it mean to one knows who all? He's an uncommon love for the common man, and godly wisdom resides in the least things, so that it may well be that the voice of the Almighty speaks most profoundly in such beings as lives in silence themselves. And then the kid asks about the judge and asks how he became a part of the gang. And the kid says he saw the judge in Nacogdoches at the tent revival. And then Tobin, right? It's Tobin and the ex-priest, and Tobin smiles and says, everyone has witnessed the judge before in their lifetime. Everyone. And this is where you'll get a little bit of sense where the judge is more than just a person, potentially the devil, or at least a symbol for him as the story progresses, as you'll see. And then Tobin explains how they had 38 men. They were attacked by a bunch of Indians, and then they were down to 14, and they were running away from the Apaches. They had no bullets. They were basically, they were going to die, right? There was 14 of them. They were getting chased by like 60 Indians, and they weren't going to make it. And then he goes on to say, then about the meridian of that day, we came across the judge on his rock, there in that wilderness by his single self. Aye, and there was no rock, just the one. Irvin said he'd brung it with him. I said that it was a mere stone for the mark him out of nothing at all. He had with him that self-same rifle that you see with him now, all mounted to German silver, and that name he'd given it with that silver wire under the check piece in Latin, et in Arcadia ego, a reference to the lethal in it, common enough for a man to know his gun. I've heard sweet lips and hark from the tombs and every sort of lady's name. He is the first lady and only ever I seen with an inscription from the classics. And now the Latin phrase that he's saying, right? Et art, what was it? Let me see. So, et in Arcadia ego. It says in translation, even in Arcadia I am. But who is the I in this translation? The traditional and most accepted interpretation is, even in paradise, I, death, am present. And so the full meaning could become is that even in a utopia, even in the most beautiful and ideal place, death still exists. Et art in Arcadia ego. And so that's what the judge has written and inscribed in his rifle. No matter where, I am always there. And I referencing death. And so they continue to go on in the story, basically talking about the judge and where they saw him. And there he sat, no horse, just him and his legs crossed, smiling as we rode up, like he'd been expecting us. He's an old canvas kit bag and an old woolen Benjamin over the one shoulder. In the bag was a brace of pistols and a good assortment of specie, gold and silver. He didn't even have a canteen. It was like you couldn't tell where he'd come from. Said he'd been on a wagon company and fell out to go alone. Davy wanted to leave him there. Didn't set well with his honor, and it don't to this day. Glanton just studied him. It was a day's work to even guess what he had made out to figure on that ground. I don't know to this day. There's a secret commerce, some terrible covenant. You mind? You'll see I'm right. He called for the last 2 pack animals we had, and he cut the straps and left the wallets to lay where he fell, and the judge mounted up, and the Glanton gang rode side by side, and soon there was coverison like brothers. The judge sat that animal bareback like an Indian and rode it with his grip and his rifle perched in the withers, and he looked about him with the greatest satisfaction in the world, as if everything had turned out just as he planned, and that day could not have been finer. We'd not rode far before he struck up a new course about 9 points to the east. He pointed out a range of mountains maybe 30 miles distant where he pulled for those mountains, and none of us asked what for. By then, Glanton had given him the particulars of the situation in which he'd installed himself, but if being naked in arms in that wilderness and half the Apaches in pursuit worried him at all, he kept it to himself entire. Basically what's happening here is that the judge finds the Glanton gang, or the judge finds the Glanton gang at this point, and he's like, I'm alone, let me join your tribe, let me join your gang. And they're like, okay, here's our situation. We had 38 men, we're down to 14, we're being chased by these Apaches that are just a couple miles behind us. And the judge is like, okay, I'm like, all right, I'll come with you guys. And then, without really even asking, he's like, there's a volcano over there. And so the judge sends them towards the volcano as the Apaches are following them. Remember, they have no ammo at this point. And on the way up, as they start to get to the volcano, they start to go up. And there's a depiction in the book where basically it's so hot that even the hooves of the horses are not starting to melt, but basically starting to melt. Like it's extremely hot. Like they're climbing up this volcano, and it seems like it was active. And on the way up, the judge keeps stopping to chip away at the hot coal and collect some of it on the way up. And when they get to the very top, the Apaches are basically surrounding them, and they're now starting to climb up. So they're at the top of this volcano, and there's really nowhere to go. The Apaches have surrounded the volcano, and they're basically starting to come up with them, and everyone's freaking out. But the judge is just at the top, and basically once they're at the top, they're just like, all right, well, this is where we die. This is where it ends. But the judge is just mixing together all the stuff that he was collecting on the way up. And then eventually, as everyone's just awaiting their death, the judge starts pissing in his concoction, and then he tells everyone else, you guys need to start pissing in here as well. So as he's mixing all this together, everyone starts pissing in this concoction. They let it sit for an hour. And eventually the judge loads it into their rifles. And just like that, he's made homemade gunpowder. And just to taunt them, the judge actually holds up a white flag to the Apaches, basically saying surrender. He knows that they're not going to accept their surrender. They think like, oh, they have no ammunition. Let's go get them. Let's go slaughter them. And as the Apaches get closer, they fill all of their stuff with their rifles, and then they use that homemade gunpowder from the judge, and they kill all of the Apaches, which I think in the book says they end up killing like over 50 Apaches. And before we move on in the story, for me personally, this is where the judge evolves from really a man to a symbol, possibly demon or the devil himself. I'm not really sure how Cormac McCarthy wants him depicted, but at first the judge is just this strange, too tall, too pale, too hairless. He knows too much. He's too skilled. But in this chapter, you realize it's not just eccentric. He's not human in the ordinary sense. He appears alone, waiting with no supplies, no horse, and yet he's completely calm, as if he was summoned by fate himself. And the Meristone isn't just a rock, it's a mythic maker, right? He's placing himself in the land as if he belongs to no geography. Like he claims it. It's just this barren wasteland and one rock. And there you have the judge sitting on it, waiting for the Glanton game, as it seems like. And then his rifle, inscribed with the phrase "Et in Arcadia ego." It tells you exactly who he is. The message is clear. Even in paradise, I am here. The eye signaling death, but also violence, war, and in this book, just the annihilation of innocence. And so oddly, he just knows everything. Not just practically, but also cosmically. As we'll get into the judge's lessons, he's extremely learned. He knows everything. He's very philosophical, knows multiple languages. Like, he's everything, right? It's just weird. And as they're going up this volcano, he made gunpowder from the volcanic ash and urine. He reads classic text. He speaks 5 languages, plays the fiddle, rides bareback, and dances like a demon. And the most terrifying of it all, he does it with this glee. And most of the time, he's also naked, which I don't know why he's always naked, but he is. And what's interesting is that through every story, the judge doesn't merely survive, he essentially like reshapes his fate and the fate of the gang. And as the gang is concerned, and they're out of ammo, death closing in, he doesn't panic. As everyone's waiting their death, he's just kind of like, we got this. We're going to do it. And then he creates his own salvation, and he manufactures death itself. And so for me, this is the point where we get a sense of like, there's the judge as a man, as we've seen him so far, and then he essentially transcends into like this symbol or this demon, and really he becomes more of a man in the story in my eyes at this point. So far in the book, we have seen the kid kind of just wander aimlessly. He's joined the Captain White gang where they got absolutely destroyed. He gets sent to prison. He gets recruited by the Glanton gang. They kind of go out. They start scalping a couple dead bodies already. They start seeing kind of the lawless land, and they're traveling. He starts to learn a little bit more about the judge. And now at this point, this is where we get to really the action of the book, right? This is the first massacre that the Glanton gang, spoiler alert, is about to commit. And it gets a little crazy, kind of like the scene where Captain White's gang got absolutely obliterated. But This is where we're at in the story. They continue to travel, and this is where we're about to get into the First Massacre. So it says, in the days to come, they would ride up through a country where the rocks would cook the flesh from your hand, and where other than rock nothing was. They rode in a narrow enfiladale along a trail strewn with the dry, round turds of goats, and they rode with their faces averted from the rock wall and the bake oven air which it rebated. The slant black shapes of the mounted men stenciled across the stone with the definition austere and implacable, like shapes capable of violating their covenant with the flesh of the author them and continuing autonomous across the naked rock without reference to son or man or God. For the next 2 weeks they would ride night by night. They would make no fire. They had struck the shoes from their horses and filled the nail holes with the clay, and those who still had tobacco used their pouches to spit in, and they slept in caves and on bare stone. They rode their horses through the tracks of their dismounting, and they buried their stool like cats, and they barely spoke at all. Crossing those barren gravel wreaths in the night, they seemed remote and without substance, like a patrol condemned to ride out some ancient curse, a thing surmised by the blackness, by the creak of leather, and the chink of metal. And eventually, at this point, they've been traveling for about 2 weeks, and they finally come across what the mission was set out on, a tribe or a village of Apaches. And to be sure, they sent out 2 scouts to investigate the area. They want to make sure, like, okay, we've been sent out to scalp a bunch of Indians, the Apache tribes, by the Mexican government. I think we finally found it. And so they send 2 people, and they go on, and they're like, all right, let's just make sure this is what we're looking for. So 2 mornings later, the Delawares returned from their dawn reconnaissance and reported that the Galenos camped along the shore of a shallow lake less than 4 hours to the south. They had with them their women and children, and they were many. Glanton, when he rose from this council, walked out the desert alone and stood for a long time looking out upon the darkness down country. They saw to their arms, drawing their charges from their pieces and reloading them. They spoke in low voices among themselves, although the desert round lay like a great barren plate gently quaking in the heat. In the afternoon, a detachment let the horses out to water and led them back again, and with the dark Glanton and his lieutenants followed the Delawares out to scout the enemy's position. We got an hour, maybe more. When we ride in, it's every man to his own. Don't leave a dog alive if you can help it. How many is there, John? Did you learn the whisper in the sawmill? There's enough to go around, said the judge. Don't waste powder and a ball on anything that can't shoot back. If we don't kill every N-word here, we need to be whipped and sent home. So this is rather an eerie scene being set in the story. We've seen to come to know that this landscape is essentially just hell on earth. But we're about to see the actual brutality of the Glanton gang in action finally. And remember, the Glanton gang was hired to just bring back the scalps of the Indian warriors. That was it, right? Just the Indian warriors, nobody else. But here they're saying that they're going to absolutely annihilate every living and breathing thing in this town, women and children included, right? Nobody's off limits from getting scalped at this point. And then it goes on to say, within that first minute, the slaughter had become general. Women were screaming, and the naked children, and the one old man tottered forth waving a pair of white pantaloons and saying that he's surrendering. The horsemen moved among them and slew them with clubs or knives. When Glanton and his chiefs swung back through the village, people were running out under their horse hooves, and horses were plunging, and some men were moving on foot among the huts with torches and dragging the victims out, slathered and dripping with blood, hacking at the dying and decapitating those who knelt for mercy. There were in the camp a number of Mexican slaves, and these ran forth calling out in Spanish, and they were brained or shot, and one of the Delawares emerged from the smoke with a naked infant dangling in each hand, and squatted at a ring of midden stones, and swung them by the heels, each in turn, and bashed their heads against the stones, so that the brains burst forth, and the fontanelle of a bloody spew of humans on fire came shrieking forth like berserkers, and the riders hacked them down with their enormous knives, and a young woman ran up and embraced the bloodied forefeet of Glanton's warhorse. Absolutely crazy. So they come into this town, and they're basically like, look, I know we're supposed to just kill the Indian soldiers, but we're going to absolutely annihilate everyone. And then you get the scene where one of the Delawares takes two babies and basically swings them as hard as he can against a rock, basically obliterating them, right? And so this is kind of where it comes into play. Like, if they ever made this into a movie, how? How could you make this into a movie? I mean, you'd have to take out all the fighting scenes because they're just that brutal and gruesome. But once the massacre is over, the Glanton gang went about collecting their prizes, which is the scalps. And they walked about the massacre, basically taking the scalps of absolutely anybody that was there. Women, children, old people, Indians, didn't matter. One of the Delawares passed with a collection of heads, like some strange vendor bound for market, the hair twisted about his wrist and the heads dangling and turning together. But before they leave the scene of the crime, the judge actually spared one of the young Apache boys. And he was like, we're going to take this Apache boy, and we're going to have him join our gang. And as they rode out for a few days back to their base camp to collect their money for the scalps that they held over one night in the mountains, the horses all but fainting, Dave found the heathen much advanced upon them. They fought their first strand in the dawn falling, and they fought them running for 8 days and nights on the plain and among the rocks in the mountains, and from the walls and aztecas and abandoned haciendas, and they lost not a man. On the third night they crouched in to keep of old walls, slumped mud with the fires of the enemy not a mile distant of the desert. The judge sat with the Apache boy before the fire, and it watched everything in the dark berry eyes, and some of the men played with it and made it laugh, and they gave it jerky, and they saw it chewing and watching gravely the figures that passed above it. They covered it with a blanket in the morning. They covered it with a blanket, and in the morning the judge was dandling with one knee while the men saddled their horses. Toadvide saw him with the child as he passed with his saddle, but when he came back 10 minutes later, leading his horse, the child was dead, and the judge had scalped it. Toadvine put the muzzle of his pistol against the great dome of the judge's head. God damn you, Holden. You either shoot or you take that away. Do it now. So this gives you a twisted look into the mentality of the judge. I mean, he strung along this young survivor, basically saying, like, look, we absolutely annihilated your entire village, but you can come with us. We'll take care of you. We'll salvage you. And then, with absolutely no intentions of ever keeping him alive, he just kills him and scalps him. Even though everybody was, like, playing with him, giving him jerky, they gave him a blanket to sleep with, and then the judge the next morning is just, all right, I have no use for you, like, I'm just going to scalp you. It just kind of gives you a sense of, like, who the judge is. So eventually they stop back into town, right, where they first, I think, Chihuahua City, where they got Toadvine and the kid when they were prisoners. And they come back with all of their scalps to collect their money. It says, hundreds of onlookers pressed about as the dried scalps were counted out upon the stones. Soldiers with muskets kept back at the crowds, and young girls watched the Americans with huge black eyes, and boys crept forth to touch the grisly trophies. There were 128 scalps and 8 heads of the governor's lieutenants and his regime came down into the courtyard to welcome them and admire their work. And so right here, they're getting treated like kings upon their arrival. It says, the lieutenant yielded the point with a smile, and the trias had done the same. They arrived in good order, shaved and shorn. So basically what's happening here is they came with their prizes. They had 128 scalps, and the Mexican government was like, great, you did exactly what we wanted you to. So now we're going to offer you a feast. And so they come in good order, shaved and shorn, and turned out in their new boots and finery. The Delawares strangely austere and menacing in their mourning coats, all together about the table set for them. Cigars were presented, and glasses of sherry poured, and the governor, standing at the head of the table, made them welcome and issued orders to their chamberlain that every need be seen to. Soldiers attended, fetching the extra glasses, pouring wine, lighting cigars from a wick in a silver holder designed for just that purpose. The judge arrived last of all, dressed in a well-cut suit of unbleached linen that had been made for him in that very afternoon. Whole boots of cloth exhausted in squads of tailor as well as in that fabrication. His feet were encased in nicely polished gray boots, and his hand he had held a Panama hat that had been spliced together from 2 such lesser hats. by such painstaking work that the joinery did scarcely show at all. These scenes and the scenes like them were repeated night after night. The citizenry made address to the governor, but he was much like the sorcerer's apprentice, who could indeed provoke the imp to do his will, but could in no way make him cease again. The baths had become bordellos, the attendants driven off. The men Whitestone fountain in the plaza was filled at night with naked and drunken men. Cantinas were evacuated as if by fire, and the appearance of any two of the company of the Americans found themselves in ghost taverns with drinks on the tables and cigars still burning in the clay ashtrays. Horses were ridden indoors and out, and as the gold began to dwindle away, shopkeepers found themselves presented with debits scrawled in butcher paper in a foreign language for whole shelves of goods. Stores began to close, charcoal scrawls appeared on the lime-washed walls, Mejor los Indios. The evening streets stood empty, and there were no pasesos, and the young girls of the city were boarded up and seen no more. On the 15th of August, they rode out. And as they leave the town, they continue to slaughter everyone that they come across. It doesn't even matter if they're Indian or not, right, at this point. And they rode west into the mountains. They passed through small villages, doffing the hats like folk, whom they would murder before the month was out. Mud pueblos that lay like plague towns with the crops rotting in the fields, and what stuck not driven off by the Indians wandering at will, and none to herd or tend to it. And many villages almost wholly depopulated of male inhabitants, where the women and children crouched in terror in their hovels, listening until the last hoofclop died in the distance. And so basically what you have here is they come back to Chihuahua City, and for weeks on end, they're basically just living like kings. They're able to do whatever they want. And everyone's like, you got to get the Glanton gang out of here. Like, they're partying. They're basically raping our women. They're taking all of our gold. They're drinking all of our liquor. And that's just the Glanton gang, right? They come in, they absolutely annihilate villages. They come back to this treated like kings, and then they just take what's theirs. They do whatever they want, and then they just leave. And so at this point, they leave Chihuahua City. And they're basically like, all right, we've kind of overextended our stay. Now we're going to continue to do our journey. We're going to go get more scalps, and we're going to get more money, right? That's their entire purpose, is they're just going to continue to kill people, scalp them, and then come back so that they can get paid. So eventually they travel out west, and they continue until they come across a town called Nakarai, and they post up in a cantina, right? Another saloon, another bar, right? This is just what they always do. And they start getting into an altercation with the people in the bar. As if they were trying to leave the bar, a few of them made it out, right? So they kind of start fighting in the bar. They're messing with each other. And then as they're starting to leave the bar, about 3 or 4 of them go out. And then the judge was the one that they saw if they left the bar, they would all get shot, because not only were they in an altercation in the bar, but people outside were also seeing this altercation. And so they started to raise their guns, and now they figured, like, oh shit, this is going to be an all-out shootout, and the only way out of this is to kill everybody here. And this is just another town that they stopped in, right? This is even like this is more civilized town, not just like an Apache tribe type thing. And so it goes on to say, here's the scene for the whole thing. Other knives were already in play. Dorsey was grappling with the Mexicans, and Henderson Smith had drawn his bowie and had severed a man's arm with it. And the man standing with the dark arterial blood spraying between his fingers where he had tried to hold the wound shut. The judge got Dorsey to his feet, and they backed towards the cantina with the Mexicans feinting and jabbing at them with their knives. From inside came the uninterrupted sound of gunfire, and the door frame was filling up with smoke. The judge turned at the door and stepped over the several corpses sprawled there. Inside, the huge pistols roared with intermission, and the 20 or so Mexicans who'd been in the room were strewn about in every position, shot to pieces among and overturned chairs and the tables with the flesh splinters blown out of the wood and the mud walls pocketed everywhere by the big conical bullets. The survivors were making for the daylight in the doorway, and the first of these encountered the judge there and cut him with his knife. But the judge was like a cat, and he sidestepped the man and seized his arm and broke it and picked the man up by his head. He put him against the wall and smiled at him, but the man had begun to bleed from his ears, and the blood was running down between the judge's fingers and over his hands. And when the judge turned him loose, there was something wrong with his head, and he slid to the floor and did not get up. And so at this point, you got to imagine, One of the guys tries to cut the judge, and he sidesteps him, and he grabs him by his head. And then he picks him up and literally just squishes it like a watermelon. And then when he drops him, his entire head is just completely disformed from this. And then those behind him had meanwhile met with the great battery of gunfire, and the doorway was jammed with the dead and dying, where there was suddenly a great ringing silence in the room. The judge stood with his back to the wall. The smoke drifted through like fog, and the shrouded figures stood frozen. In the center of the room, Toadvine and the kid were standing back to back with their pistols at port like duelists. When they left the cantina 10 minutes later, the streets were deserted. They had scalped the entire body of the dead, sliding about in a floor that they had been packed clay and was now wine-colored mud, obviously from all the blood that was going on. There were 28 Mexicans inside the tavern and 8 more in the street, including the 5 the ex-priest had shot. And by the time they leave town, there was a bounty placed on the head of the Glanton gang in their massacre for what they did in this civilized town. So now at this point, obviously, the Glanton gang couldn't stay in this town, and so they continued to head more in like the southwest region. And on the way down out of the mountains towards the western sea, led them through green gorges thick with vines, with parakeets and gaudy mascues leered and croaked. The trail followed a river, and the river was up and muddy, and there were many fords, and they were crossed and recrossed the river continually. And then one night, when they were all sitting there around the fire, as they usually do at nighttime, Toadvine saw the judge was once again inscribing things into his book. And the judge does this really interesting thing that wherever they go, if he sees or finds something that he's never seen before or doesn't know, he'll take out his book and he'll either write it as a journal entry, or he'll literally, as an artist, draw it and then throw the thing away. And he just keeps this collection of things that he keeps finding in his journal. And so Toadvine sat watching him as he made his notations in the ledger, holding the book towards the fire for the light. And he asked him, what was the purpose in all this? The judge's quill ceased its scratching. He looked at Toadvine, then he continued to write again. Toadvine spat in the fire. The judge wrote on, and then he folded the ledger shut and laid it on one side and pressed his hands together and passed them down over his nose and mouth and placed them palm down on his knees. Whatever exists, he said, whatever in creation exists without my knowledge, exists without my consent. He looked up about at the dark forest in which they were bivouacked. He nodded towards the specimens he'd collected. These anonymous creatures, he said, may seem little or nothing in the world, yet the smallest crumb can devour us. Any smallest thing beneath yon rock out of men's knowing. Only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth. What's a suzerain? A keeper or overlord. Why not say keeper then? Because he is a special kind of keeper. A suzerain rules even when there are other rulers. His authority countermands local judgments. Toadvine spat. The judge placed his hands on the ground. He looked at his inquisitor. This is my claim, he said, and yet everywhere upon it are pockets of autonomous life. Autonomous. In order for it to be mine, nothing must be permitted to occur upon it, save by my dispensation. Toadvine sat with his boots crossed before the fire. No man can acquaint himself with everything on this earth, he said. The judge tilted his great head. The man who believes that the secrets of the world are forever hidden lives in mystery and fear, superstition will drag him down. The rain will erode the deeds of his life. But the man who sets himself the task of singling out the thread of order from the tapestry will by the decision alone have taken charge of the world, and it is only by such taking charge that he will effect a way to dictate the terms of his own fate. I don't see what that has to do with catching birds. The freedom of birds is an insult to me, and I'd have them all in a zoo. That'd be a hell of a zoo. The judge smiled. Yes, he said, even so. And so this is one of the many lessons that you get from the judge. In the book, there's a lot of times where they're sitting around the fire and they're basically talking to each other. And then the judge basically talks. He's essentially preaching to everybody, and he's talking to them about his philosophy. And there's many of them. I couldn't include them all in here. Also, be a super long podcast. But that was definitely one I wanted to add. It's really important to kind of understand some of the philosophies that he has in here. And so As they're continuing to head west, they get attacked by an Apache tribe. Now, there's this kind of like a chapter in its own, but essentially the kid gets lost for several days, right? The Glanton gang is attacked by Indians in the dark. They get ambushed, and they all kind of go their own ways. It's pitch black, raining, and the terrain is rough, full of rocks, cliffs, and flooding streams. And then the attack causes a total breakdown of order, and the kid gets separated in the chaos. And he survives by hiding and wandering. And then the kid spends several days surviving on very little, dodging possible Indian scouts and trying to stay alive. And at this point in the book, it's also December around this time frame. And even though they're in Texas and it may be warm, during the nighttime, it gets extremely cold. And kind of the whole chapter is just basically plotting out like how every day he's sleeping, it's basically snowing on the ground, and then he's sleeping literally with his own clothes, and he's just doing anything he can to survive. And eventually the kid rejoins the Glanton gang several days later, almost dying from his journey alone. And per usual, the Glanton gang makes another stop into a town. And would you guess it? They ended up back in another bar. But in this bar, they're so beaten up and dirty that the bar owner thinks that they are, in the book it says N-words. And so he doesn't even serve them, right? Again, remember this is the 1850s. People are very racist back here. Eventually, one of the Glanton members gets pretty fed up with this. It says, Jackson had risen up and he pulled one of his pistols from his belt. Owens pointed the pistol at him. You put that down, he said. You better forget about giving orders and shoot the son of a bitch. Put it down, goddamn man. Tell him to put it down. Shoot him. He cocked the pistol. Jackson fired. He simply passed his left hand over the top of the revolver, and he was holding the gesture brief as a flint spark and tripped the hammer. The big pistol jumped and doubled handful of Owen's brains went out the back of his skull and plopped in the floor behind him. He sank without a sound and lay crumpled with his face in the floor and one eye and the blood welling up out of the destruction at the back of his head. Jackson sat back down. Brown rose and retrieved his pistol and let the hammer back down and put it back in his belt. Most terrible N-word I ever seen, he said. Find some plates, Charlie. I doubt the old lady's out here anymore. And this doesn't really turn out to be another massacre, but eventually what does happen, again, they're in another civilized town. The sheriff comes in and confronts the Glanton gang and wants to know if they're the ones that killed the bartender. He says, and so he's talking to the Glanton gang, and he's basically like, are you guys the ones that killed this person? Like, who killed this? Is it you guys? And then the judge speaks up. Kindly address your remarks to me, Lieutenant, said the judge. I represent Captain Glanton in all legal matters. I think you should know, first of all, that the captain does not propose to be called a liar, and I would think twice before I involved myself in him in an affair of honor. Secondly, I've been with him all day, and I can assure you that neither he nor any of his men have ever set foot in the premises of which you allude. The lieutenant seemed stunned at the baldness of these disclaimers. He looked up from the judge to Glanton and back again. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Then he turned and pushed past the men and quit the place. The lieutenant came back again in the evening, and he and the judge sat together, and the judge went over the points of law with him. The lieutenant nodded, his lips pursed. The judge translated for him Latin terms in jurisprudence. He cited cases civil and martial. He quoted Coke and Blackstone, Examander, and Thales. Again, showing and alluding to just how intelligent the judge was. And in the morning, there was new trouble. A young Mexican girl had been abducted. Parts of her clothes were found torn and bloodied under the north wall, over which she could only have been thrown. In the desert were drag marks, a shoe. The father of the child knelt clutching a blood-stained rag to his chest, and none could persuade him to rise and none to leave. And so, in the book, there's a lot of times when the Glanton gang shows up, and there's usually a child that is raped and killed. Now, it's never said outright that it is the judge, but you can almost reference or kind of come to the conclusion that, like, the judge is doing all this. He's essentially raping these children. He's killing them. And the Glanton gang kind of knows it's the judge, but at the same time, they never come to him and they never really, accuse him of it for many reasons. And again, it's a lawless place. It's the 1850s, and so they kind of just get away with it. And Again, in the craziness of the scene, it just shows how powerful the judge is depicted. He and the Glanton gang are getting accused of murder, and during the nighttime, a little girl gets raped and killed. And it does, again, doesn't specifically spell out, but I'll let you take a guess at who it is. Probably the judge. Before leaving the town, the gang recruits a couple more town folks, and they come with them on their expedition since they want to travel to California as well, because they're taking, going out west. And they take a few people with them, including one of the guy's brothers, which they call the idiot in the book. And what's interesting is they literally keep him in a literal cage when they travel with him, because the guy is just essentially illiterate. And so they travel with this idiot in a cage, and as they recruit more people for their numbers. And now what we have here is another lesson from the judge. Again, they're sitting around the campfire, they're talking, and the judge has another philosophical point to point out here. And so it's a little bit more of like a lesson about war that's been given to the group from the judge. And I think it's just so interesting that I'm just going to read it to you. It said, "The truth about the world," he said, "is that anything is possible. Had you not seen it all from birth and thereby bled of its strangeness, it would appear to you for what it is, a hat trick in a medicine show, a fevered dream, a trance bipulate with chimeras having neither analog nor precedence, an itinerant carnival, a migratory tent show whose ultimate destination, after many a pitch in many a muddied field, is unspeakable and calamitous beyond reckoning. The universe is no narrow thing, and the order within it is not constrained by any latitude in its conception to repeat what exists in one part or in any other part. Even in this world, more things exist without our knowledge than with it, and the order in creation which you see and which you have put there, like a string in a maze, so that you shall not lose your way. For existence has its own order, and that no man's mind can compass, that mind itself being a fact among others." And then Tobin and the ex-priest are like, "You're full of shit, and your thoughts are absolutely wacky." And he goes on to say, the good book does indeed count war and evil," said Irving. "Yet there's many a blood tale of war inside it. It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here, before man was. War waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and the way it will be. The way and not some other way." He turned to Brown, from whom he'd heard some whispered slum and demur. "Ah, Davy," he said, "it's your own trade we honor here. Why not rather take a small bow? Let's each acknowledge it." "My trade? Certainly. What is my trade?" "War. War is your trade, is it not?" "And it ain't yours?" "Mine too, very much so." "What about all them notebooks and bones and stuff?" "All other trades are contained in that of war." "Is that why war endures?" "No. It endures because men love it, and old men love it in them, those that fought and those that did not. That's your notion?" The judge smiled. "Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows too that the worth of a merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put a hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stakes because they inherit in the worth of the principles and define them. But the trial of chance, or the trial of worth of all games, aspire to the condition of war, for here that which is wagered swallows up game, player, all. Suppose two men with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale, a turn of a card? The whole universe for such a player has labored clinking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at the man's hand, or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enchantment of the game to its ultimate its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is the preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance in either one. In such games as have their stakes, the annihilation of the defeated decisions are quite clear. The man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within the larger will, which, because it bonds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game, because war is at last forcing the unity of existence. War is God. Tobin shook his head. You've a blasphemous tongue, Holden, and in truth, I was never a priest, but only a novitate into the order. Journeyman priest or apprentice priest, said the judge. Men of God and men of war have strange affinities. I'll not second say you and your notion, said Tobin. Don't ask it. Ah, priest, said the judge. What could I ask of you that you have not already given? So this is that last sentence. What could I ask of you that is not already given? So essentially, I mean, this is a lot, right? It's really hard to read this sometimes because the way it's written, it's just very difficult to understand. It's very philosophical. It's very dense. So basically what the judge is saying here is that war is God, and every man has it in him. Every man has violence, and every man is basically living in this way, whether they like it or not. And Tobin, the ex-priest, is basically saying, like, I'm not like you. I'm not crazy. I don't kill. I'm not a warmonger like you, and I have some values. And then the judge is basically saying, it doesn't matter if you were a priest or not. He's like, you're the same as I am. And then Tobin, the ex-priest, is like, I'm not going to say that I'm like you, and you're not going to let me say it, or you're not going to make me say it. And then the judge says, what could I ask of you that you've not already given? And the judge is basically saying, you could say whatever you want, but you've already showed with your actions that you and I are the same. We've gone on this scalp hunting expedition together. I've seen you kill people. I've seen you scalp people. We're basically the same. And his claim is that war is God. And to go into a little bit more, war is not a thing men do, it's what defines them. And he goes on to say war is not evil, it is not avoidable, it is not man-made, war is eternal, war is God. Right? This is not just the judge's personal philosophy, this is the central thesis of Blood Meridian. There's no divine justice, no moral framework guiding the world. There's only violence, force, and those willing to impose their will. And this isn't just about military conflict, it's about violence as a law of nature. And as the judge says, morality is illusion, peace is weakness, civilization is built on killing, and he is the one who understands it best. So after this lesson, the gang wakes up and they're ready to continue their way out to California with their whole new gang, right? And at this point, they arrive to the Colorado River. And the Glanton gang arrives at the confluence of the Gila and the Colorado Rivers, a strategic choke point for westbound travelers. There's an existing ferry operation run by the Yuma. It's like the Yuma tribe and some Mexican laborers. And the gang sees a potential to profit and control for this. And they basically think whoever runs the ferry controls the movement of settlers, soldiers, and gold seekers trying to cross into California through this Colorado River. And so what they do is they seize the ferry. And without warning, the Glanton gang attacks. They kill the existing ferry operators, both Mexican workers and Native Americans. Several Yuma men are slaughtered during the takeover, and the Glanton gang takes possession of the ferry, installing his own men as the toll collectors. They're establishing control in this. And they basically turn the ferry into like an extortion racket, right? They're charging exorbitant rates for passage. If travelers can't pay or simply look vulnerable, they're robbed and killed. Some travelers are even murdered and their bodies just dumped right off into the river. And they set up camp on the riverbank, setting up fires and tents and turning this outpost into their own little lawless stronghold. And this creates tension with the Yuma tribe, right? The Yuma tribe is infuriated because you have the Glanton gang who just came in here, took over their entire operation, started killing everybody, and just pushed them out. And then they set up camp in here. And so they start to quietly begin preparing for revenge. And you can tell that tensions escalate as it becomes clear that the Glanton gang is not leaving and is just killing anyone indiscriminately. And the Yuma begin to understand that the Glanton gang has broken any diplomatic or practical trust in here. And so Basically, what happens at first is they come in, they kill everybody, they take over the ferry, and there's this ferry operator who at first is like, whether out of fear or greed, agrees to do what the Glanton gang wants to do. And at first, they're a little practical, right? They just charge a lot of rates, but eventually you get to the point where, like, if you just look vulnerable, we're just going to rob you and then kill you. And then eventually, they just start killing everybody, and they push out the Yuma tribe. And so now the Glanton gang has the stronghold on what used to be the Yuma tribe's territory. And so now the Yuma tribe is like, oh, like, you just fucked with the wrong tribe. Like, we are going to get our revenge on you guys. And so this is kind of like the calm before the storm. There's like an eerie stillness in the camp, right? The men drink, they tend to the ferry, they talk around the fires. Some feel uneasy, but there's no sense of imminent danger, right? Because there's a ton of them in the Glanton gang. They have rifles, they have pistols, they have power. They're like, who's going to overthrow us, right? We kill everyone that we come across. And in the book, McCarthy has this slow pacing. You can kind of feel the violence simmering beneath the surface. And then finally it happens. The Yuma attack. And so this happens at night, right? Everyone's kind of doing their own thing like they usually do. They get drunk at night. They're doing their own thing. And then the Yuma finally, after I think it's like weeks again, McCarthy doesn't really date things, so I'm just going to assume it's weeks at this point. The Yuma tribe collectively gather up enough people, and then they squabble up an ambush. And here's kind of how it goes. They swarmed up the hill towards the fortifications where the Americans lay sleeping, and some were mounted and some were afoot, and all of them armed with bows and clubs, and their faces blackened or pale with fard in their heart, and their hair bound up in clay. The first quarters they entered were Lincoln's, where they emerged, and a few minutes later one of them carried the doctor's dripping head by the hair, and others were dragging behind the doctor's dog bound at a muzzle, jerking and bucking across the dry clay of the concourse. Now, Lincoln was the guy who was initially in charge of the ferry, who basically gave it over to the Glantons because, again, out of fear or greed. So they go into his quarters first. And then when they entered Glanton's chambers, he lurched upright and glared wildly about him. The small clay room he occupied was entirely filled with a brass bed he had appropriated himself, some migrating family, and he sat up in it like a debauched feudal baron, while his weapons hung in a rich array from the finales. Caballo and Pello mounted into the actual bed with him and stood while they were attending. The tribunal handed him at his right side common axe and hickory helve, of which was carved with pagan motifs and tasseled with the feathers of predatory birds. Glanton spat. "Hack away at me, you red N-word," he said, and the old man raised the axe and split the head of John Joel Glanton to the thrapple. So now what we have here is the Yuma tribe absolutely decimating the Glant tribe, right? They absolutely ambushed them while they were sleeping. So you have Lincoln, who was just killed, who was in charge of the ferry operations, and then Glanton himself, who's just been butchered and decapitated by the Yuma tribe. And then when they entered the judge's quarters, again, they found that he had been with the idiot and a girl of perhaps 12 years cowering naked in the floor. Behind them also, naked, stood the judge. So I'll let you kind of just envision that in your head. You've got the judge, a 12-year-old girl, and this idiot, who's an illiterate guy, all naked in his room, right? And the judge was not expecting them to come in here. He was holding leveled at him with the bronze barrel of a howitzer. The wooden truck stood in the floor and the straps pried up and twisted off the pillow blocks. The judge had the cannon under one arm, and he was holding the lighted cigar over the touch hole. The Yumas fell over one another backward as the judge put the cigar in his mouth and took upon his, I can't really read that word, and stepped out the door and back past them and down the embankment. So when they come into the judge's thing, obviously, right, we see that scene with him where they're all naked. But the reason he doesn't get killed is because he has a rifle and he has his cigar that can basically make it go off. And the Yuma tribe understands this. They're like, oh shit, he has a gun. So they kind of back out of it. And that's how the judge is able to escape. And a couple other people escape as well, including Toadvine, Tobin, the ex-priest, and the kid, along with the judge. And Toadvine and the kid fought a running engagement upriver through the shore, breaking with arrows clattering through the cane about them all. They came up at the willow breaks and climbed the dunes that descended the far side and reappeared again. Two dark figures anguishing upon the sands, now trotting, now stooping. The report of the pistol flat and the dead in the open country. The Yumas who crested out upon the dunes were 4 in number, and they did not follow, but rather fixed them upon the terrain to which they had committed themselves, and then turned back. The kid carried an arrow in his leg, and it was butted against the bone. He stopped and sat and broke off the shaft a few inches from the wound, and then he got up again and then went on. At the crest of the rise, they stopped and looked back. The Yumas had already left the dunes, and they could see the smoke rising darkly along the river bluff. To the west was the country, was all rolling sandhills where man might lie in hiding, but there was no place the sun would not find him, and the only wind could hide his tracks. And so at this point, the Glanton King is completely mutilated, except for a couple of people. The only survivors that we know of right now are Toadvine, Tobin, the ex-priest, the kid, and then obviously the judge. And you have to remember, at this time too, the kid was shot with an arrow in his leg, literally butted up to the bone, and so he snaps off the shaft, and he just has this arrow in him. So they're running away. But at the same time, for about a day or two, the kid are being chased by a few Indians. And they would stop every now and then, right? They had their pistol and a couple bullets with them. And every time they would stop, they would let the Indians get a little bit closer. And the kid would shoot a couple of the Indians with the very few bullets that they had left. And eventually, after they killed so many of them, they just stopped pursuing them and they just kept going. And then in the desert, they meet back up with the ex-priest. So it was the kid and Toadvine who were running away. And then in the desert, as they continue going, that's where they meet up with the ex-priest. And while they were all traveling, then they also met up with the judge, of course, because the judge is everywhere, right? And those who travel in desert places do indeed meet with the creature surpassing all description. The watchers at all well rose to the better to witness these arrivals. The imbecile was fairly loping along to keep pace. The judge on his head wore a wig of dried river mud, from which it protruded bits of straw and grass, and tied upon the imbecile's head was a rag of fur with the blackened blood side out. The judge carried in one hand a small canvas satchel, and he was bed-raped with meat like some medieval penitent. He hove up the diggings and nodded them in good morning, and he and the idiot slid down the bank and knelt and began to drink. And now that the Glanton gang was broken up and they were surviving on their own, their true colors came out, right? Now that they don't have to be part of this gang, they don't really have to pretend to like each other. But now everything comes out. And so the kid, Toadvine, and the ex-priest all fear the judge. They all did from the start, and they never really trusted him. And at this point, they all kind of see each other, but they're a little bit of a distance away. And the judge keeps tempting them to join up forces, and they could just march together. And then the judge says, fine, you don't want to end up with me, but at least sell me some of your ammunition because I know you need it. So the judge has ammunition. The guys are basically down to their last few bullets. And so the kid rose up and slung the flask over the strap of his shoulder. His trouser leg was black with blood, and the bloody stump of his shaft jutted from his thigh like a peg and hanging implements upon. He spat and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and he looked up at Toadvine. It ain't country you've run out of, he said. Then he made his way across the sink and up on the bank. The judge followed him with his eyes, and when the kid reached the sunlight at the top, he turned and looked back at the judge, who was holding open a satchel between his naked thighs. Again, the judge is just always naked at this point. So basically what was happening here is the judge is trying to sell the kid a bunch of ammunition. Well, what he's really trying to do is he's trying to lure the kid in because he's just trying to kill him. Like, everybody knows at this point, like, it's a free-for-all, every man for himself. And the judge is trying to lure him in, and he's just like, come get your ammunition. Like, I know you need ammo. I've got it. I'll sell it to you. But you have to come to me. And so the kid basically is given, again, let's bring it a little bit back to the juggler, right? The 4 of Cups, that tarot card that he got. He's given a decision to decide his fate. And at this point, Toadvine and Tobin, or the ex-priest, are like, look, you've got a few bullets left. This is your only chance to kill the judge. Like, you have to do it now. And so it says, $500, he said, powder and ball included. The ex-priest was at the kid's side. Do him, he hissed. The kid took the pistol, but the ex-priest clung to his arm, whispering, and when the kid pulled away, he spoke aloud. Such was a fear. You'll get no second chance, lad. Do it. He is naked. He is unarmed. God's blood, do you think you'll best him any other way? Do it, lad. Do it for the love of God. Do it, or I swear your life is forfeit. But eventually the kid decides not to shoot the judge, and they decide just to keep running from the judge. And during this, everyone knows that this has become kind of a game of cat and mouse, and now the judge is out to kill him, right? The cat's out the bag. And so they eventually run for about a day or two in the desert and eventually lose the judge. And it says, they were much reduced to their wounds and their hunger, and they were made poor show as they staggered onward. By noon, their water was gone, and they sat studying the barrenness about them. A wind blown from the north. Their mouths were dry. The desert upon which they were entrained was desert absolute, and it was devoid of feature altogether, and there was nothing to mark their progress upon it. The earth fell away on every side equally as it in its architecture, and by these limits they were circumcised, and all of them they locusts. They rose on and went on. The sky was luminous. There was no trace to follow, other than the bits of cast-off left by the travelers, even to the bones of men drifted out of their graves in the scalloped sands. In the afternoon, the terrain began to rise before them, and the crest of a shallow esker they stood and looked back to see the judge, much as before, some 2 miles distant on the plain. They went on. Eventually, ironically, they lose the judge, and then ironically, they're actually saved by some Indians who give them shelter, food, and water, and just enough to make it to San Diego. And so as Toadvine and the kid are traveling, they eventually get to San Diego because that was their ultimate destination, so they just kept going west. It was evening of the following day, and when they entered San Diego, the ex-priest turned off to find them a doctor, but the kid wandered on through the raw mud streets out past the houses of hide in their rows and across the gravel strands to the beach. He entered a tavern and sat in the darkened corner watching the groups of men at the tables. No one asked him what he had wanted in that place. He seemed to be waiting for someone to come for him, and after a while, 4 soldiers entered and arrested him. They didn't even ask his name. In his cell, he began to speak with a strange urgency of things few men had seen before in his lifetime, and his jailer said that his mind had come uncottered by the acts of blood in which he had participated in. So, eventually what happened here was they get into San Diego finally. Toadvine goes out to basically go look for a doctor, and then the kid goes into a bar as he always does, and then 4 soldiers out of nowhere come and take the kid and throw him in jail. And then one morning this is crazy how it ends, and this is why I say the judge is more of a man and he's more of like this mythical symbol or this creature. And one morning he woke up to find the judge standing at his cage, hat in hand, smiling down at him. He was dressed in a suit of gray linen, and he wore new polished boots. His coat was unbuttoned, and in his waistcoat he carried a watch chain and a stick pin in which is built leather-covered clip that had small silver-mounted derringers stocked in rosewood. He looked down the hallway of the crude mud building and donned his hat and smiled again at the prisoner. And so here they start talking, and the kid starts asking how he ended up in prison, where Toadvine and Brown were, and just a bunch of other questions. And then the judge goes on to say, told him the truth, that you were the person responsible. Not that we all have the details, but they understood that it was you and none other who shaped events along such a calamitous course, eventuating in the massacre at the ford by the savages with whom you conspired. Means and ends are of little moment here, idle speculations. But even though you carry the draft of your murderous plan with you to the grave, it will none the less be known in all of its infamy to your Maker. And as that is so shall it be made be known to the least of men, all in the fullness of time. The judge smiled. He spoke softly in the dim mud cubicle. You came forward, he said, to take part in a work, but you were a witness against yourself. You sat in judgment on your own deeds. You put your allowances before the judgments of history, and you broke with the body of which you were pledged a part and poisoned in all its enterprise. Hear me, man. I spoke in the desert for you and you only, and you turned a deaf ear to me. If war is not holy, man, is if war is not holy, man is nothing but antic clay. Even the cretin acted in good faith according to his parts. For it was required of no man to give more than he possessed, nor was any man's share compared to another's. Only each was called upon to empty out his hearts, and the common one did not. Can you tell me who that one was? And eventually, as they go on to speak, he's basically asking the judge, he's like, how did I end up here? What happened to Toadvine and Brown? And the judge is like, I told them everything. I told them that you guys were the ones who did all the massacres in the Colorado River and the massacres all the way leading up to San Diego. And eventually, the kid is released 2 days after. A Spanish priest had come to baptize him, and he had flung water at him through the bars like a priest casting out spirits. An hour later, when they came to get him, he grew giddy with fear. He was taken before the Al-Qaeda, and this man spoke with him in a fatherly manner in the Spanish language, and he was turned out into the streets. The doctor that he found was a young man of good family from the east. He cut open the trouser leg with scissors and looked at the blackened shaft of the arrow and moved it about. A soft fistula had formed about it. And so you got to remember, after this entire point, I mean, it's probably been a week or two at this point, and this kid still has the arrow in his thigh. And so now the kid is released, and he's wandering the town of Free Man, right? He just had surgery. He got the arrow taken out of his leg. And then in public, there's a hanging. And when the kid attends it, there's so many people that he can't see what's going on or who's being hung. And it goes on to say, in the evening when he returned to that place, there was no one there at all. A guard leaned in the gatehouse portal chewing tobacco, and a hanged man in the rope ends looked like effigies for two frightened birds. As he drew near, he saw that it was Toadvine and Brown. And from this, you have to assume that this was the doing of the judge, whatever he told the townspeople of what Toadvine and Brown did. But for some reason, he spared the kid. He still got him thrown in jail, but he didn't get him hanged. And so, it's kind of interesting that the judge essentially has played all this out. Or you can imagine that this is what happened, because it'd be a little, I don't know what's the right word, but like for Toadvine and Brown to get hung and then the kid thrown in jail and the judge is like all pampered in a new suit and everything. I'm assuming, again, McCarthy doesn't lay it out, but he's probably got something to do with it here. So once the kid was taken out of prison, he stays in San Diego for a little bit. He goes from job to job, kind of like house to house. He's just traveling about, trying to find his own way. And then in the last chapter, it actually jumps to 1878. It says, in the late winter of 1878, he was on the plains of North Texas. He crossed the Double Mountain Fork at the Brazos River in the morning with skim ice lay around the sandy shore, and he rode up through a dark dwarf forest of black and twisted mesquite trees. He made his camp that night on a piece of high ground where there was a windbreak formed of a tree felled by lightning. He'd no sooner go to his fire to burn that he saw across the prairie in the darkness another fire. Like his, it twisted in the wind. Like his, it warmed one man alone. And so now the kid is 45, I believe, since he was born in 1833, if I remember correctly, 1878, around 45, if my math is correct. We don't get much of what happened in between this, but it seems like the kid now, the man, it's actually referencing him in the book as the man, right? So we went from the kid to the man. You don't really know what's going on with his life, but it seems like it's been pretty calm at this point. He hasn't engaged in his mindless violence. He hasn't gone on to do more scalping expeditions. But now he's just making a journey over to the northern plains of Texas. And we don't really know why. He's just kind of going. But he was over in California in the San Diego area, and now he's going to go visit the northern plains of Texas. And of course, where does he end up? He ends up in a bar. And so he's in this bar. And he wiped his mouth and turned around and placed his elbows on the bar behind him. Watching him across the layered smoke in the yellow light was the judge. Yes, 45 now. I don't know how much time has passed, 20, maybe 30 years. Hasn't seen the judge since he saw him in the cage in the prison. It was the last time he talked to him. Hasn't seen the judge since then. He, for whatever reason, decides that he wants to go to the northern plains of Texas, just to go. And of course, waiting for him, just like he was waiting for the Glanton gang on that rock. Here sits the judge. He was sitting at one of the tables. He wore a round hat with a narrow brim, and he was among every kind of man, herder and bullwhacker, and drover and freighter, and a miner and a hunter and a soldier and a peddler and a gambler and a drifter and a drunkard and a thief. And he was among the dregs of the earthery and in the earth and beggary 1,000 years, and he was among the scapegrace scions of eastern dynasties, and all that motley assemblage. He sat by them, and yet alone, as if he were there for some sort of man entire, and he seemed little changed or none in all these years. So that's a little bit eerie there too, because 20, 30 years have passed, and he sees the judge, and it's like he hasn't aged a bit, right? Decades later, by some cruel chance, or maybe even fate. The judge is there, just sitting at the same fucking bar as the man, all the way out in Texas. And here he was, waiting for him. And again, did you catch that part? He was sitting there, and it seemed like little had changed, or none, in all that years. So the judge gets up, walks over to the man, and then he starts talking to him. He says, "Do you believe it's all over, son?" He turned. The judge was standing at the bar looking down at him. He smiled. He removed his hat. The great pale dome of his skull shone like an enormous phosphorescent egg in the lamplight. The last of the true, the last of the true. I'd say they're all gone under now, saving me and thee. Would you not? So the man tries to get up and tries to leave, but the judge insists that he stays and just talks for a little bit. Go, have a drink. So the man stays, and then he starts talking to the judge. Drink up, he said, drink up. This night thy soul may be required of thee. He looked at the glass. The judge smiled and gestured with the bottle. He took up the glass and drank. The judge watched him. Was it always your idea, he said, that if you did not speak, you would not be recognized? You seen me. The judge ignored this. I recognized you when I first saw you, and you were a disappointment to me, then and now. Even so, at the last I find you here with me. I ain't with you. The judge raised his bald brow. Not, he said. He looked at him in a puzzled and artful way, and he was a passable thespian. I never come here hunting you. What then? Said the judge. What would I want with you? I'll come here for the same reason as any man. And what reason is that? What reason is what? That these men are here. They come here to have a good time. The judge watched him. He began to point out various men in the room and asked if these men were here for a good time or if indeed they knew why they were here at all. Everybody don't have to have a reason to be someplace. That's so, said the judge. They don't not have to have a reason, but order is not set aside because of their indifference. He regarded the judge warily. Let me put it this way, said the judge. If it is so that if they themselves had no reason and yet are indeed here, must they not be here for a reason of some other? And if this is so, can you guess who that other might be? No. Can you? I know him well. And here's what the judge is saying in essence. He says that you think that you're outside of this. He says that you think by not choosing, you're escaping judgment. But I've always seen you. You're not innocent. You're disappointing. You belong to the order I create, whether you accept it or not. And this is chilling now because it's the end of the book. You, I, and the judge now see him as something above human. He is essentially chaos himself. He is proclaiming that the judge has transcended and now become something more of a symbol. That symbol being violence and chaos. And as the man becomes more agitated, he urges the judge to make his point. A man seeks his own destiny and no other, said the judge, will or nil. Any man who could discover his own fate and elect therefore some opposite course could only come at last to that self-same reckoning at the same appointed time. For each man's destiny is as large as the world he inhabits and contains within it all opposites as well. This desert upon which so many have been broken and vast and calls for largeness of heart, but it also ultimately empty. It is hard, it is barren, its very nature is stone. He poured the tumbler full. Drink up, he said. The world goes on. We have dancing nightly, and this night is no exception. The straight and the winding way are the one now that you are here what to do with the years count since the last two met together. Men's memories are uncertain, and the past that was differs little from the past that was not. He took the tumbler and the judge had poured, and he drank and set it down again. He looked at the judge. I've been everywhere, he said. This is just one more place. The judge arched his brow. Did you post witness, he said, to report to you on the continuing existence of those places you'd quit them? That's crazy. Is it? Where is yesterday? Where is Glanton and Brown? And where is the priest? He leaned closer. Where is Shelby, whom you left on the Merce Isles of Elias in the desert? And where is Tate, whom you abandoned in the mountains? Where are the ladies? Ah, the fair and tender ladies with whom you danced at the governor's ball when you were a hero anointed in the blood of the enemies of the republic you'd elected to defend. And where's the fiddler, and where the dance? I guess you can tell me. I'll tell you where he is. A war becomes dishonored, and its nobility called into question. Those honorable men who recognize the sanctity of blood will become excluded from the dance, which is the warrior's right, and thereby will dance become a false dance, and the dancers false dancers. Yeah, it gets a little crazy. And yet will be one there always who is true dancer. And can you guess who that might be? You ain't nothing. You speak truer than you know, but I will tell you. Only that man has offered up himself entire to the blood of war, who has been to the floor for the pit and seen horror in the round and learned at last that it speaks to the innermost heart. Only that man can dance. Even a done animal can dance. The judge set the bottle on the bar. Hear me, man, he said. There is a room on the stage for one beast and one alone. All others are destined for a night, and that is eternal and without name. One by one they will step down into the darkness before the footlamps. Bears that dance and bears that don't. And so let's break this down because it's very philosophical and there's a lot going on here. Again, whenever the judge speaks and tries to make his points and his lessons, it's very dense. So I'm going to try to do my best to kind of like break this down for you. So this passage is the final philosophical climax of Blood Meridian. It's Judge Holden's ultimate sermon, not just about war. It's about existence, fate, memory, power, and meaning itself, right? And when he's talking about dancing, essentially what he's talking about is life itself. It's about death and war. So it's not really dancing. It's kind of just he's using that as an example because they're in a bar and a lot of people are dancing. So that's what he says. He says, a man seeks his own fate, or a man seeks his own destiny and no other. For each man's destiny is as large as the world he inhabits and contains within all opposites as well. And so the judge is saying, you cannot escape your fate. Even if you think you've chosen a different path, you're still on the same road. And the road is you. Fate is not a single line, it's the whole world. And no matter the course you take, you are still inside of it. And remember the verse, the world goes on, we have dancing nightly, and the night is no exception. Dancing here is not literal, it's a war, it's a ritual, it's the cosmic theater. And the judge sees existence itself as a dance. And only those who embrace the dance, the blood, the chaos, and the totality of war get to participate in it fully. And this has been the judge's philosophy throughout the entire book. And this is the scene of the book's final philosophical confrontation between the judge, who is the eternal force of domination, war, power, and ritual violence, and then the kid / the man now, who is a figure of resistance against the judge. His ambiguity, the consciousness who has refused to fully join the judge's worldview. And now at the end, the judge basically tells him, there is no escape. There never was. You were mine the whole time. The dance is mine, the world is mine, and war is God. Eventually, the judge drifts away and leaves the boy alone, wanting to escape the confrontation he just had with the judge. He goes upstairs with one of the women from a brothel, because remember, this is a bar and a brothel. It's the 1878 now. But she kicks him out because she needs to keep business running, right? But in the book, it phrases it that the kid is scared to leave. Like not begging, but he's essentially trying to get the girl, the prostitute, to just be like, look, can I just stay in this room? Like, I don't want to go back downstairs. I don't want to essentially confront the judge. I just want to stay here. And in the book, it creates this sense of like this eerie, like he doesn't want to go back out in the world. He doesn't want to go back because of the conversation he just had with the judge. And so eventually he goes back downstairs because the prostitute's like, look, we got to keep running the business. And then he heads back downstairs. And he stood at the edge of the dance floor. A ring of people had taken the floor and were holding hands and grinning and calling out to one another. A fiddler sat on a stool on the stage of a man walked up and down, calling out the order of the dance, and the gesturing and stepping in the way he wished them to go. Outside in the darkened lot, groups of wretched Tonkawas stood in the mud with their faces composed in strange lost portraits within sashwork and window lights. The fiddler rose and set the fiddle to his jaw. There was a shout, and the music began, and the ring of dancers began to rotate ponderously with a great shuffling. But he went out back. And this is so interesting how Cormac McCarthy uses the philosophy of dancing while there's literal dancing going. And the judge is basically like, look, if you don't partake in the dance, your fate has already been sealed. And the kid has a choice here, right? Going back to the juggler and the tarot cards, he has this. Just wait until we get to the end of it. But he basically has a choice here. He can stay and dance, literally, and continue with what the judge said. But then the kid decides not to, or he decides not to take the worldview of the judge, and he decides not to dance, literally, with what's going out here. And so he went out back. He went down the walkboard towards the Jakes, which is basically just another outhouse. He stood outside listening to the voices fading away, and he looked again at the silent tracks of the stars where they died over the darkened hills. Then he opened the rough board door of the Jakes and stepped in. The judge was seated upon the closet. He was naked, and he rose up smiling and gathered him in his arms against his immense and terrible flesh and shut the wooden barlich home behind him. So what we have there is the kid decides not to partake in the dancing. He goes out back to the Jakes, which is another outhouse. And as he opens the outhouse, there's the judge, again naked, standing there. And he grabs the kid, pulls him in, and shuts the door behind him. And in the dance hall, a young man had joined the fiddler, and he kept the measure of the music with a pair of spoons, which he had clapped between his knees. The horse sashayed half naked, some of them their breasts exposed. And in the muddled dog yard behind the premises, two men went down to the boards towards the Jakes. A third man was standing there urinating into the mud. Is someone in there? The first man said. The man who was relieving himself did not look up. I wouldn't go in there if I was you, he said. Is there somebody in there? I wouldn't go in. He hitched himself up and buttoned his trousers and stepped past them and went to the Jakes towards the light. The first man watched him go and then opened the doors of the Jake. Good God Almighty, he said. So what you have here is whatever the judge did, I'm assuming he raped and killed the man, as the judge has done so many times throughout the book. And as the man opens the doors, he sees who knows what happened to the kid because it's never said in the book. But just remember that scene in the bar where the judge takes up the man's head and essentially crushes it like a fruit. And so you can only imagine what the judge did to the kid. And now we kind of come back to the scene back in the bar where all the dancing is happening. And this is where the judge is back in here dancing with everyone, naked still after he already killed the man. He bows to the fiddlers and the chasses backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat. And he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he perutes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. So that last sentence, right? So that's kind of the end of the book. That's where it ends. There's a little bit of an epilogue there too, but it's about like a paragraph long. So that's the end of the book. That was the very last line of the book. And now there's so many speculations as to what happened to the man. But until But I think all we know, unfortunately, is that he was probably raped and murdered by the judge. I mean, just remember the scene again where he squished the guy's head like a watermelon, and just from that, you can imagine what happened in that little outhouse. And it's not only the climax of Blood Meridian, but also the philosophical, spiritual, and symbolic culmination of everything Cormac McCarthy has laid out over the last 300 pages. It's essentially like the judge was waiting for this moment. The judge told him a long time ago, only that man who has offered up himself entire to the blood of war, only that man can dance. And the kid never offered himself up entirely. He showed mercy, he resisted total submission to the judge's ideology, and he refused to become the judge's mirror. And so the judge, the executioner of all those who resist the dance, claimed him, literally, in all forms. And because the kid failed the final test, right? Because when we go back to the fiddler, or not the fiddler, the juggler, and his 4 tarot cards basically saying you have a fate, you have your 4 cups, you can choose your own fate. Remember back to all those times that the kid had the possibility of killing the judge. And the one that sticks out the most is when they were running in the desert after the Yuma tribe took out the Glanton tribe, or the Glanton gang. He had the opportunity to completely change his fate and kill the judge when he was sitting there unarmed, naked, and he had his gun and he had a pistol and he just didn't take the shot. Maybe because he was trying to show mercy, maybe because he was trying to show the judge that I'm not like you. But in the end, this is what happens. And so throughout the novel, the kid remains ambiguous, right? He shows small moments of decency, even though he never really acts decisively to stop the judge. I mean, in chapter 22, he even says, I ain't with you. And in return, the judge tells him, you speak truer than you know. But here's the twist. If you're not with the judge, you're essentially against them. And no one opposes the judge and lives because the judge is no longer a man. He's a symbol for death, like what was written on his revolver. Even in paradise, I am there, meaning death. And so because judge is not a man, he is death, the final line is he never sleeps. He says that he will never die. And the kid's death is not just physical, but it's also like a spiritual annihilation. He failed to stand up to evil when it mattered the most. He couldn't stop the judge, and for that, he is consumed by him, by death, by the judge, by whatever. And so now we followed the kid across deserts and border towns. We watched him ride with monsters, watched him become one, right? We stood in the shadow of the judge, a man who may not even be a man, as he danced, lectured, and slaughtered his way through the pages. And now we've come to the end. But Blood Meridian doesn't end the way stories usually do. There's no redemption, there's no victory, and no clear meaning tied with a bow. What we're left with is silence, really a question. Because this book isn't about the past, it's about us, about what lies beneath the surface of every so-called civilized man. It asks, what is violence? Is it learned? Or is it the oldest language we know? Because remember when we were talking back and the judge said, war has always been, and it was just waiting for its ultimate practitioner. And what happens when law, order, and even God himself go silent? Only voices left. Is it the judges, meaning violence, war, and death? And Cormac McCarthy didn't write a novel. Essentially, he wrote scripture for a godless world, which was once a time, back in that time. And whether you see Blood Meridian as a warning, a masterpiece, or a waking nightmare, one thing is for sure, if you read it, you will never forget it, especially the very brutal acts that happen. And that's everything that I have for this. Thank you for listening. Until next time, ride steady, stay human while you still can. And if you've made it this far, I would really appreciate if you can give this podcast 5 stars. It really helps more than you think it does. And I'll see you guys in the next episode.